Good evening and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what the ancients saw when they looked up at the night sky and realized that not all beings moved freely between the heavens and the earth? Have you ever considered that somewhere in the dust of Mesopotamia, in clay pressed with wedge-shaped marks, someone recorded a moment when a barrier was drawn, when a separation was made absolute? If you enjoy these journeys into the quieter corners of ancient history, where mysteries rest in fragments of stone and clay, please do take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your location and the local time in the comments below. We'd love to know where you're settling in for tonight. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Let the soft hum of a fan or the whisper of evening wind be your only companion. Settle into a comfortable place, let your breathing slow and deepen, and when you're ready, let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast, alluvial plain, somewhere in the southern reaches of what we now call Iraq, in a time before any king's name was written, before any city rose with walls and gates. The land you are looking at is flat and endless, cut through by two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose waters carry the soil down from distant mountains and deposit it here, grain by grain, season by season, building something new out of what was old and worn away elsewhere. This is Sumer, though no one living in those earliest days would have called it that. To them, it was simply the land, the only land that mattered, bounded by the distant hills and the vast marshes to the south, where the rivers grew tired and meandered through reed beds before surrendering to the sea. The climate here is not gentle. The sun climbs high and fierce in the summer months, and the heat presses down on the earth with a weight that makes the air shimmer and distort. The land receives little rain, perhaps only a handful of inches during the winter season, and often not even that. Droughts come without warning, settling over the plain like a veil, and when they do, the rivers shrink and the fields turn the color of old bone. Yet in the spring, when the snowmelt from the distant Armenian highlands swells the rivers, the waters can surge with terrifying power, flooding across the low-lying fields and destroying in a few days what has taken months to build. Living here required not merely strength, but an intricate knowledge of the water, of when to plant and when to harvest, of how to build channels and reservoirs to catch the precious moisture and hold it through the dry months ahead. The earliest peoples to settle this land did so perhaps 9,000 years before the birth of what we now call history. They came gradually, following herds of game, drawn by the promise of fish in the rivers and birds in the marshes. Slowly, across generations that left no written record, they learned that they could scatter seeds of barley and wheat in the soft mud left behind after the floods, and that these seeds would grow into food more abundant than any hunt could provide. They learned to dig channels to direct the water where they needed it, to build small villages of mud brick near the water's edge, to keep flocks of sheep and goats that could survive on the rough scrubland vegetation. With these skills came the first real permanence. Families stayed in one place, generation after generation. Children were born, grew, and had children of their own in the same village, under the same sky. Picture one of these earliest settlements, perhaps no more than a few hundred people clustered together. The houses were made of mud brick, shaped in wooden molds and left to dry in the fierce sun, until they were nearly as hard as stone. The roofs were thatched with reeds cut from the marshes, or covered with more mud brick if the family had the resources. A typical house might be small, 3 or 4 rooms arranged around a courtyard where the family would gather in the evening when the heat began to lift. The walls were thick, designed to keep out the heat of the day, and small windows high up allowed air to move through without admitting too much sun. Inside, the family ate bread baked in clay ovens, dates from palm trees, onions, and occasionally the meat of goat or sheep, along with fish dried or salted for storage. They drank beer, brewed thick and nutritious from barley, a staple that was both food and drink, and much safer to consume than water that could carry sickness. Work began before dawn. A farmer would rise in the darkness when the air was still cool and make his way to the fields with his tools: a simple plow pulled by oxen, a hoe for breaking up soil, baskets for carrying grain. His wife might remain with the younger children, tending the small garden near the house where she grew vegetables and herbs, grinding grain between stones to make flour, spinning wool from the family's sheep into thread that could be woven into cloth on a simple loom. As the sun rose, it painted the landscape in shades of gold and brown, and the day's work would settle into a steady rhythm: the scratch of the plow, the call of birds, the distant sound of other families working their own fields, the endless soft splash of water in channels and ditches. As these settlements grew and merged, as the centuries accumulated like layers of soil, something began to shift in how people understood their world. They no longer saw themselves as merely part of nature, but as makers and builders, shapers of the land itself. They had taken the chaos of flood and drought and imposed order upon it through channels and dikes and careful timing. This sense of order, of intentional arrangement, began to color how they thought about everything: about the seasons, about the stars, about the powers that seemed to move above them in the sky. The night sky above Sumer was unutterably clear. With no city lights to dim it, the stars blazed in such profusion that they seemed almost solid, a great river of light flowing overhead. The peoples of Mesopotamia watched these lights with intense attention. They noticed that most stars held their positions relative to one another, night after night, season after season, forming patterns that became familiar, the shapes we still call constellations, though the ancients saw different images than we do. But they also noticed that some points of light moved in ways that seemed purposeful, tracing paths across the sky that took them from east to west over the course of years, their movements subtly different from the great wheel of the fixed stars. These wandering lights came to be understood as beings of a different order, divine beings, entities that moved between the realm of heaven and the realm of earth according to patterns that were meaningful, but not immediately obvious. The moon, which clearly influenced the tides and the floods, seemed to be the most powerful of these. The sun, of course, was recognized as the source of all life and heat. And there were others, 5 points of light that traced their own patient paths, beings that would later be named by peoples who spoke other languages as Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. In the increasingly complex settlements that developed around the great rivers, as populations grew larger and required more sophisticated organization, these observations began to crystallize into something more formal, a kind of theology, a way of understanding the relationship between the powers above and the people below. The rivers themselves came to be understood not merely as natural phenomena, but as expressions of divine will, as the physical manifestation of agreement between the gods and humanity. The fact that the rivers brought life also meant that they could bring death, and this paradox seemed to teach a deeper truth. That order was a constant achievement, something that had to be maintained through careful attention and proper relationship with the divine powers. It was in these increasingly organized cities, in temples that rose taller and more complex with each generation, that the need for writing was born. By roughly 5,000 years before the present day, in cities such as Uruk, Lagash, and Ur, scribes began to press marks into soft clay tablets, not to record grand narratives or philosophical thoughts, but simply to keep track of practical matters: stores of grain, number of sheep, land measurements, tax obligations. These first marks were pictures, simple drawings that represented objects: a barley stalk for grain, a circle for a measure of area, a sheep's head for sheep. But over time, these pictures became more abstract, more conventional, and eventually became the system we call cuneiform, made up of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a stylus. This invention of writing was not a sudden breakthrough by a single genius, but a gradual evolution over centuries, driven by the practical needs of a complex society. As settlements grew into cities, as trade networks stretched across greater distances, as temples accumulated wealth and needed to keep track of it, The memory of individuals and the songs of tradition became insufficient. There needed to be a way to record information that could persist beyond the life of the person who knew it, that could be transmitted across space to distant merchants and across time to future generations. Writing solved this problem, and in solving it, transformed everything. Among the earliest things that the Sumerian scribes chose to write about, once they moved beyond simple accounting, were the stories of the gods and the cosmic order. These were not new stories. They had been part of the oral tradition for countless generations, passed from parent to child, recited in temples, sung by traveling musicians. But now they could be fixed, written down, preserved in clay that would outlast flesh and memory. And as these stories were written, as they were read and reread by successive generations of scribes, they began to develop a more fixed form, a more canonical version, even as different cities and different temples maintained their own variations. In these early texts, composed in the Sumerian language by scribes who believed they were recording truths that had been known since the beginning of time, a complex picture of the cosmos began to emerge. At the top of the hierarchy were the great gods, An, the sky itself, remote and powerful; Enlil, the storm and the wind, the enforcer of divine will; Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the trickster and the protector. These were beings of immense power, beings who had created the world and maintained it through their will and their constant attention. But the texts also spoke of other beings, lesser powers that served the greater gods. These beings had names that marked them as different from humanity, though not as distant as the great gods. They were called the Anunnaki, and later texts would distinguish among the Anunnaki between two groups: the Igigi, who were said to belong to the sky and the upper realms, and the Anunnaki proper, who were more closely associated with the underworld and the administration of the dead. The exact nature of these beings, their precise functions and powers, varied from text to text and from city to city, but a consistent theme emerged. They were workers, servants, entities created for specific purposes to serve the greater gods. According to the accounts that survived in clay, the Igigi in particular were understood as beings of the sky, entities that existed in the upper regions of the cosmos, that moved among the stars and the heavens, that served purposes that were not entirely clear to ordinary humans. They were not hostile, but they were not friendly in the way that familiar gods might be. They were distant, purposeful, and their business was not the business of humanity. The temples kept records of the offerings that were meant to appease them, the proper words to speak if one needed to invoke their names, the signs in the sky that indicated their movements and moods. And yet, according to certain of these texts that became more detailed and more explicit over time, there was something more to the story of the Igigi than simple service and obedience. There were accounts, obscure and scattered among the temple records, that suggested a time when things had been different, when the Igigi had not been confined to the sky alone, when they had moved more freely between the realms, when they had had a different relationship with the earth and with humanity. These accounts suggested that something had changed, that a boundary had been drawn, that a separation had been made permanent. And some of these accounts spoke of a tablet, a record, a written account that specified the terms of this separation, that made clear why the Igigi could never again reach the earth, why the boundary between the heavens and the lower world had been rendered absolute. Years passed, and the tablets accumulated in the temple archives. Scribes copied older texts, made corrections, added commentaries in the margins. Scholars debated the proper interpretation of obscure passages. Kings commissioned new copies of particularly important texts, had them stored in temple libraries, alongside records of taxes and property. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth became part of the fabric of Sumerian religious understanding, a truth that was both mysterious and completely familiar, like a landscape you have known your entire life, but whose distant mountains you still never fully understand. It was into this world of accumulated texts and careful preservation, into the civilization that had learned to speak to the future through marks on clay, that the tablet we speak of emerged, or rather, it is more accurate to say that it has come down to us through this tradition, surviving the collapse of the civilization that created it, passing through the hands of conquerors and scholars, waiting in darkness until modern eyes would one day find it and attempt to read its message. As the centuries accumulated and Sumerian civilization grew more complex, the understanding of the cosmos became increasingly intricate and detailed. The early simple narratives about gods and lesser beings evolved into something far more sophisticated, a comprehensive vision of the universe as an ordered system, with each element in its proper place, each being with its assigned role, all governed by laws that were ancient and unbreakable. This vision did not emerge all at once, but rather accumulated gradually, as different priests and scribes added their own observations and interpretations to the growing body of religious literature. The Sumerian concept of the cosmos was organized into distinct realms, each with its own character and its own inhabitants. The highest realm was An, the sky itself, understood not merely as empty space, but as a conscious being, a great power that encompassed all that was above. Below this was the atmosphere, the realm of weather and wind, where Enlil held dominion. Below that was the earth, the middle realm where humans lived, where the rivers flowed, where cities stood. And below the earth was the underworld, the realm of the dead, where souls went after the body ceased to function, a dark place, but not necessarily a place of punishment, simply the inevitable destination of all living things. But these realms were not sealed off from one another. They interpenetrated, overlapped, communicated. Certain beings could move between them. The gods themselves moved freely among all the realms, appearing in temples on earth, controlling the weather in the atmosphere, maintaining the stars in the sky, and overseeing the orderly reception of the dead in the underworld. It was this fluidity that made the cosmos alive, that kept it functioning as a unified system rather than as separate, isolated domains. The Anunnaki, in their various forms, were understood as the divine workforce that maintained this system. They were not independent powers in the way the great gods were, but rather they were servants and implementers of divine will. Some accounts suggested that the Anunnaki had been created specifically for this purpose, that they were fashioned from clay or from the blood of defeated enemies to serve as workers and administrators. The texts are not always entirely consistent on these details, but a general picture emerges. The Anunnaki were numerous, they were organized, they had specific tasks to perform, and they understood themselves as fulfilling a purpose that had been established for them at the beginning of time. Within this larger category of Anunnaki, the Igigi occupied a particular position. The texts that survive suggest that the Igigi were associated specifically with the upper realms, with the sky and the atmosphere. They were sometimes described as watchers, entities that observed and reported back to the greater gods about the condition of things below. In some accounts, they were builders or maintainers of celestial order, beings that kept the stars in their courses, that managed the movements of the great lights that marked time and seasons. In other accounts, they seemed to have functions that were more obscure, purposes that were not entirely transparent, even to the priests who recorded their names and attributes. What is particularly striking about the accounts that have survived is that many of them contain an undertone of ambiguity about the Igigi. They are never presented as hostile or dangerous in the way that demons or chaos forces might be, but neither are they presented with the warm familiarity that attends accounts of gods like Enki, who sometimes aided humans, or Inanna, the great goddess of fertility and love, who was understood as particularly close to human concerns. The Igigi exist in a different category, a space of neither nor. They are divine enough to command respect and offerings, but distant enough that their true concerns and purposes remain somewhat opaque. It was perhaps this very opacity, this sense that the Igigi were powerful, but strange, that they existed at a remove from ordinary human concerns, that made them fertile ground for stories about separation and boundary. If a being is distant, there must be a reason for that distance. If a being is powerful, but kept at arm's length, there must be an explanation for why. And if such explanations existed, they would be the kind of information that would be recorded in temples, that would be written down and preserved, that would be considered important knowledge for those who needed to understand the cosmic order. The texts that specifically address the separation of the Igigi from the earth are scattered and fragmentary in the forms in which we encounter them today. They do not constitute a single unified narrative, but rather they appear in bits and pieces throughout the temple literature, sometimes as passing references, sometimes as the focus of longer accounts. Some versions appear to be older, reflected in references made by later texts, while other versions seem to be later elaborations or reinterpretations of earlier material. But certain themes recur with enough consistency that scholars have been able to piece together a general outline of what the Sumerian tradition held to be true about this matter. According to these accounts, there was a time when the boundary between the realms was more permeable than it is now. The Igigi in those early days had more contact with the earth, more ability to move back and forth between the upper realms and the lower world. This was not understood as an inherent right that they possessed, but rather as a privilege that had been granted to them, a permission that existed only because no prohibition had been explicitly made. In the earliest times, so the texts suggest, such prohibitions were not necessary. All beings understood their proper places and their proper roles. There was order, yes, but it was an order that had not yet been fully tested, an order that had not yet required explicit enforcement. But according to the accounts, something happened that changed this situation. The texts are not entirely clear about what this something was, and different versions offer different explanations. Some accounts speak of a transgression, an Igigi or group of Igigi that overstepped their authority, that did something they were not meant to do. Other accounts speak of a desire, an impulse that arose among the Igigi to leave their assigned realm, to linger longer on Earth than they should, to involve themselves in earthly concerns in ways that were not appropriate to their station. Still other accounts suggest that the issue was not misbehavior exactly, but rather a fundamental incompatibility, that it had gradually become clear that the Igigi and the earthbound creatures and beings could not coexist safely in the same space, that their natures were too different, their purposes too divergent. What all of these accounts have in common is the sense that a decision was made, a judgment rendered by the greater powers, most particularly by Enlil, the enforcer of cosmic order. This decision took the form of a severing, a cutting off, a barrier that was imposed between the realm of the Igigi and the realm of Earth. It was not described as a punishment in the harshest sense. The Igigi were not destroyed, were not cast into darkness, were not made to suffer. Rather, they were confined, separated, their freedom of movement restricted, so that they could no longer freely move between the sky and the earth. The crucial thing about this separation, according to the accounts, was that it was made absolute, made permanent, rendered unbreakable by a kind of cosmic law that even the greatest gods would respect. It was not merely a temporary restriction, not something that might be lifted if the right prayers were said or the right offerings were made. It was, according to the texts, written into the very fabric of how the cosmos was organized, and this permanence, this unbreakability, had to be recorded and documented, had to be made clear and explicit, had to be spelled out in a way that would be understood by any being who consulted the records. And so, according to the tradition, a tablet was created. This tablet contained the record of the separation, the terms of the boundary, the reasons why it had been imposed, and the absolute nature of the restriction. The tablet was understood not as a new law, but as a documentation of an ancient law, something that had always been true but now needed to be made explicit in written form. The tablet was placed in a temple, in one of the great centers of Sumerian religious learning, where it could be consulted by those who needed to understand the cosmic order, where it could be preserved for all future generations. Now, we must be careful here to distinguish between what the ancient Sumerian texts actually say and what modern interpreters have made of them. The surviving fragments of cuneiform tablets that refer to this separation and to the documentation of it, do not always use identical language, do not always present the story in exactly the same way. Some tablets that speak to these matters are quite old, dating to periods of Sumerian history that stretched back 3 or more millennia before the Common Era. Others are younger, from the later periods of Mesopotamian civilization, when Akkadian and other languages had begun to blend with Sumerian in the religious and scholarly texts. But the basic narrative, that the Igigi were separated from the earth, that this separation was permanent and cosmic in nature, that it was recorded on a tablet, this basic narrative appears consistently enough that we can say with some confidence that it was part of the Sumerian religious tradition, that it was something that priests and scribes took seriously and attempted to preserve and transmit. The question of which specific tablet, or which specific group of tablets, constitutes the actual record of this separation is more complicated. Many thousands of clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia have been excavated and preserved over the past century and a half. They reside in museums and private collections around the world. Some have been studied extensively, translated, and analyzed. Others remain only partially understood, their significance obscure. Some are still buried in the earth, waiting to be discovered. Among all of these tablets, there are indeed several that contain references to the Igigi, to their separation from the earth, and to cosmic boundaries and restrictions. One particularly significant tablet, or rather, one particularly significant text that has come down to us in multiple copies on different tablets, is a composition that scholars have come to call the Era Epic, though this title was not given by the ancients themselves. This text, which dates in its earliest known form to around the middle of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, is primarily focused on the god Era and his deeds, but it contains significant material about the Igigi and their role in the cosmos. In the Era Epic, the Igigi are described as celestial beings, warriors of the sky, who normally maintain a position of watchfulness from their heavenly stations. The epic makes clear that their normal state is one of being fixed in place, not moving freely about, but stationed firmly. But perhaps equally significant, though less immediately obvious, are certain passages in what scholars call the Enuma Elish, another great cosmological text that was likely composed in Babylon, but that incorporates much earlier Sumerian material and concepts. The Enuma Elish is primarily concerned with the rise of the god Marduk to supremacy among the gods, but it also contains descriptions of the organization of the cosmos, the arrangement of different beings in different realms, and passing references to restrictions and boundaries that have been imposed to maintain cosmic order. Another text that appears to be highly relevant is sometimes called the Atrahasis poem, a composition that deals with the creation of humanity and the early history of the world. In this text, there are accounts of the Igigi and of their labor in maintaining cosmic order, and there are references to their eventual withdrawal from involvement in earthly affairs. The Atrahasis poem appears to present the separation of the Igigi from the earth as something that happened gradually, over the course of generations, as the Igigi gradually stepped back from their role in the immediate vicinity of human civilization. Yet another text, sometimes referred to as the Descent of Inanna, though this is a later Akkadian or Babylonian composition, preserves certain Sumerian concepts and narrative elements, and includes descriptions of the underworld and the boundaries between realms that are consistent with the earlier Sumerian understanding of cosmic geography. Among all of these texts, the ones that most directly and explicitly address the permanent separation of the Igigi from the earth are a collection of fragmentary accounts that appear in various temple archives. These accounts do not form a continuous narrative. They are scattered, repetitive in places, contradictory in others, like pieces of a puzzle that do not quite fit together, or like a story that has been broken apart and the pieces separated by centuries. But when these fragments are collected and studied together, they do seem to paint a consistent picture, that the Igigi were once able to move more freely between the sky and the earth, that this freedom caused problems or conflicts, that a decision was made to restrict this movement, and that this restriction was recorded in a formal way, documented in writing so that it would not be forgotten. The physical tablets that contain these accounts are themselves objects of historical interest, made from local clay, pressed into shape by human hands, marked with cuneiform signs using a stylus, and then left to dry and harden in the sun. These tablets are remarkably durable. Many have survived thousands of years with little degradation. The clay does not rot like wood or papyrus. It does not fade like ink on paper. If it is not deliberately broken or ground into powder, a clay tablet can preserve its message essentially unchanged for millennia. This durability was well understood by the ancients, and it was one of the reasons that the most important documents, the records that were meant to last, were written on clay rather than on other materials. The tablet or tablets that specifically record the separation of the Igigi would have been considered absolutely essential records, documents that had to be preserved at any cost. They would have been stored in the most secure locations within the temples, in archives that were protected and tended by specialized priests and scribes. Copies would have been made, distributed to other temple centers, read aloud to assembled audiences during religious festivals, referenced in scholarly debates about the proper interpretation of cosmic law. The message they contained, that the Igigi were separated from the earth, that this separation was permanent, that it was cosmic law, would have been reinforced constantly, made familiar through repetition, embedded in the religious consciousness of the civilization. And yet, for all of this careful preservation and transmission, these texts almost died out. When Sumer fell, when its cities were conquered by Akkadians and later peoples, when cuneiform itself eventually fell out of use, replaced by alphabetic scripts that were easier to write and learn, the knowledge contained in these ancient tablets came very close to being lost entirely. They survived because certain peoples, particularly the Babylonians, continued to use cuneiform for scholarly and religious purposes long after it had ceased to be a living language of everyday speech. Babylonian scholars made copies of Sumerian texts, preserved them in their own temples and libraries, added their own commentaries and interpretations. Without this effort at preservation and transmission, the stories of the Igigi and their separation from the earth would have vanished into silence, remembered only in the vaguest of echoes in later mythologies. But the tablets themselves, the original clay documents, did survive. Buried under the soil of Mesopotamia, sealed in the ruins of temple archives and palace libraries, they waited in darkness for thousands of years. And then, beginning in the 19th century of the Common Era, archaeologists from Europe and America began to excavate the mounds that rose above the flat Mesopotamian plain, mounds that marked the locations of ancient cities. They dug carefully through layers of earth and rubble, finding pottery, tools, statues, and thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. These tablets were transported to museums, cleaned, studied, translated. Slowly, the knowledge that had been contained in them began to be recovered and made available to the modern world. The tablets that speak most directly to the separation of the Igigi from the earth came to light through this process of excavation and recovery. They were found in temple archives, in the ruins of libraries that had stood in cities such as Nineveh and Nippur. They were studied by scholars who gradually learned to read cuneiform, who began to understand the grammar and vocabulary of Sumerian, who worked to reconstruct the meanings of ancient religious concepts that had not been part of living human culture for more than 2,000 years. And as these tablets were studied, as their messages were decoded and understood, the story that they had been meant to preserve began to emerge again into the light. The tablets themselves, in their physical form, are ordinary-looking objects. They are made of clay, typically rectangular or slightly curved, their surfaces covered with the small, wedge-shaped marks that constitute cuneiform writing. They bear no obvious marks of great age. Clay does not wrinkle or fade in the way that other materials do. To look at them is to see simply rectangular tablets, perhaps the size of a hand, covered with marks. There is nothing in their appearance that would suggest the immense weight of meaning they carry, the vast age they have survived, the importance that was attached to them by the priests and scholars who first pressed the signs into their surfaces. And yet, if you could hold one of these tablets in your hands, If you could trace your fingers across the marks that a scribe made 3,000 or more years ago, you would feel the weight of all that history, all that distance, the strange intimacy of touching something that was shaped by human hands in the distant past, that was meant to last, that has indeed lasted, carrying its message down through the centuries until it reached your own hands in your own time. The tablet that speaks of the Igigi and their permanent separation from the earth is like this: an ordinary object that contains an extraordinary message, a simple piece of clay that has preserved a cosmic secret across the gulf of millennia. The meaning of the separation, the reasons for it, the circumstances that led to it, these things are not entirely clear from the surviving texts, and different scholars and different interpreters have drawn different conclusions about what they mean. But what is clear is that the separation was understood to be real, absolute, and of cosmic significance. It was not a minor restriction or a temporary arrangement. It was a fundamental restructuring of the cosmic order, a drawing of a line between the realms that could not be crossed, a sealing of a door that could not be opened. And this restructuring, this line drawing, this sealing, was considered important enough to record formally, to document in writing, to preserve in the temples where the records of divine law were kept. In a civilization that understood the written word as a powerful force, as something that could bind reality itself, that could make things true by being stated and documented, this act of writing down the separation of the Igigi was itself a kind of cosmic deed. It was not merely a record of something that had happened, but a formal statement that was meant to ensure that the separation remained in force, that it could be consulted and confirmed whenever necessary, that it stood as permanent testimony to cosmic law. Imagine now the great cities of Sumer at the height of their power and influence, perhaps in the period around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. This was a time when the land had been organized into dozens of city-states, each centered around a great temple and governed by a king or en, a figure who served as the representative of the city's patron deity on earth. The cities of Uruk, Lagash, Ur, Nippur, and Eridu were among the largest and most important, their names already ancient by the time they reached their peak, their histories stretching back into the mists of time. These were not small villages anymore, but genuine cities, with populations of tens of thousands, with walls that rose high enough to be seen from great distances, with temples whose tops might catch the last rays of the setting sun, while the streets below were already deep in shadow. The temple stood at the heart of each city, not merely as a religious institution, but as the true center of power and authority. The great temple, called a ziggurat, was a structure of monumental proportions, a stepped pyramid built of mud brick, rising in stages toward the sky. The base might be hundreds of feet on each side, and the structure might rise 20, 30, or even more feet into the air. Ramps and staircases connected the different levels, and at the summit was the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum where the god was believed to dwell, where the high priest entered only on the most important occasions, and where the most sacred rituals were performed. But the ziggurat was not the only sacred building. Surrounding it were courtyards, storage buildings, workshops, libraries, and residential quarters for the priests and their families. It was in these temples, in the libraries and scriptoriums, where the most important and learned work was done, that the tablets recording the cosmic order were kept and maintained. The head of the temple, the high priest, was typically a man of considerable learning and authority, responsible not only for the performance of rituals, but also for the preservation and interpretation of sacred knowledge. Under him worked a hierarchy of priests, each with specific roles and responsibilities. Some priests were focused on the performance of ceremonies and sacrifices. Others were skilled healers or makers of medicines. Their knowledge of plants and human anatomy derived from centuries of accumulated experience. And others still were scribes, men trained from childhood in the art of writing, who spent their days copying texts, maintaining records, teaching younger scribes the intricacies of the cuneiform system. The training of a scribe was a long process that began in childhood. A boy selected for this role, typically from a family that had some means and some connection to the temple or the royal court, would be taken on as an apprentice. He would learn first to recognize the basic signs of cuneiform, to understand how they represented sounds and concepts. This learning was not done from books, which did not exist in the modern sense, but through the direct copying of established texts. A teacher, himself an expert scribe, would show the student how to hold the stylus, how to apply the right amount of pressure, how to create the proper wedge-shaped marks. The student would practice over and over, copying the same short passages or even single signs many times until his hand gained the necessary skill and muscle memory. Over months and years, the student would progress to longer and more complex texts, working his way through standard compositions, religious hymns, mythological narratives, administrative documents, until he had internalized the full range of Sumerian writing and could compose new documents with confidence. This educational process did more than teach a practical skill. It was a form of cultural transmission, a way of embedding the student in the intellectual and religious tradition of his civilization. As a scribe copied out the old texts, he was not merely learning to write. He was absorbing the content of those texts, internalizing the stories, the concepts, the way of understanding the world that they contained. The repeated act of copying the accounts of creation, the descriptions of the gods and their deeds, the records of cosmic law and cosmic order, shaped the way the scribe thought about reality. By the time a young man had completed his training and was recognized as a full scribe, he had become, in a very real sense, a carrier and guardian of his civilization's understanding of itself and the cosmos. Among the texts that every trained scribe would have copied at some point in his education were the various accounts of the Igigi and their separation from the earth. These were not minor, obscure texts relegated to a corner of the library. They were part of the core curriculum, standard compositions that were copied over and over, that appeared in many different temple archives, that were referenced and commented on by scholars. A scribe who had been properly trained would understand the basic outline of the Igigi narrative, would be able to recite key passages from the relevant tablets, would understand the theological significance of the separation and what it meant for the proper ordering of the cosmos. In the daily life of the temple, the knowledge contained in these tablets was not merely preserved in isolation. It was woven into the fabric of religious practice and observance. When a priest prepared to conduct a ritual, he would consult the appropriate texts to ensure that every action was performed correctly, that every word was spoken properly, that no part of the prescribed procedure was omitted or altered. The rituals themselves were understood as a kind of earthly replica of cosmic processes, actions performed on earth that had their counterparts in the heavens. By performing the rituals correctly, by following the established procedures, the priests believed they were helping to maintain cosmic order, helping to keep the universe functioning as it should. The most important of these rituals, the one that drew the largest crowds and received the most attention, was the New Year festival, celebrated at the time of the spring equinox, when the waters of the rivers were rising and the land was preparing for the planting season. This festival lasted many days and involved processions, prayers, offerings, and reenactments of mythological events. The king, dressed in special garments, would process from his palace to the great temple, accompanied by priests, musicians, and crowds of ordinary citizens. There would be sacrifices of animals, cattle, sheep, goats, whose flesh would be divided, some offered to the god and some distributed to the gathered people for feasting. The greatest ceremony of the festival was the renewal of the divine presence in the temple, a ritual in which it was understood that the god departed and then returned, that the cosmos was in a state of renewal and revitalization. Within the context of these great festivals, and in the smaller daily rituals that were conducted within the temple itself, the story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth would have been regularly invoked and reaffirmed. The separation was understood as part of the essential structure of cosmic order, something that maintained the proper functioning of the universe. By acknowledging it in ritual, By reaffirming it through the recitation of the appropriate texts, the priests and the people were helping to keep the boundary in place, helping to maintain the separation that allowed things to function as they should. The ordinary people of Sumerian cities, the farmers and merchants and craftspeople who made up the majority of the population, had a different relationship to this knowledge than the trained scribes and priests did. Most people were not literate. The ability to read and write cuneiform was a rare skill, limited to a relatively small class of educated men. The common people knew the stories of the gods and the cosmos, but they knew them primarily through oral tradition, through songs and stories told by traveling musicians, through what they were taught in the family or in informal gatherings. They would have heard the basic story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth, but they would have understood it in a somewhat different way than the priest did. For the common people, the Igigi were mysterious beings, part of the divine machinery that kept the world functioning, but not beings with whom they had direct contact or concern. They were like the vast, bureaucratic apparatus of the royal court. The common person understood that such an apparatus existed, that it was important, that it performed functions necessary for the maintenance of society, but the details of how it actually worked were beyond their immediate knowledge or concern. They paid their taxes, performed their obligations, and trusted that those in power knew what they were doing. Similarly, they understood that there were divine beings in the sky, that these beings had their proper places and their proper roles, that cosmic order depended on the maintenance of boundaries and separations, but the precise details of how this cosmic order was organized and maintained were not matters that they spent much time contemplating. Yet the broad outlines of the cosmology, the general sense of a universe organized into distinct realms with different beings inhabiting each realm, the understanding that there were rules and boundaries that maintained this organization, these ideas permeated Sumerian culture at all levels. They appeared not only in formal religious texts, but in poetry, in proverbs, in the wisdom literature that mothers taught to children. They shaped the way people understood their own place in the world, their relationship to the powers above them, their understanding of what was possible and what was forbidden. In the homes of ordinary people, and we can know something of what these homes were like from archaeological remains and from the accounts written by scribes, daily life was shaped by the same cycles and patterns that shaped religious observance. The year was marked by the seasons, by the flooding of the rivers, by the times of planting and harvest. Each season brought its own work and its own risks. In the spring, when the waters rose, there was danger of flooding, but also the promise of fertile soil for planting. Families would dig channels to direct the water to their fields, would prepare the soil, would sow their barley and wheat. If all went well, if the water did not come too violently and the sun did not burn too fiercely, the crops would grow through the long, hot summer. A typical family, perhaps a farmer and his wife and their children, along with perhaps an elderly parent or a younger brother, would live in a small house of mud brick, the walls thick enough to keep out much of the heat. The house might have 4 or 5 rooms, a main living area where most of the family would gather, particularly in the cooler parts of the day or in the evening, a sleeping area where the parents and younger children would rest, a storage room where grain and other foods would be kept, perhaps a small space where the wife could work her loom or prepare food. Outside, there might be a small courtyard where the family kept a few animals, a goat or 2, perhaps a donkey. The wife would tend a small vegetable garden here if water and space allowed, growing onions and other herbs that would supplement the family's diet of bread and beer. The daily round began before dawn. The man would rise early, before the heat grew intense, and make his way to the fields with whatever tools he possessed: a plow pulled by oxen if his family had the resources, a hoe and a basket if he did not. His wife would remain at home, tending to the children, preparing the morning meal of bread and beer, beginning whatever work needed to be done that day, grinding grain, spinning wool, weaving cloth, preparing food for the evening meal. As the sun rose and the day grew hot, the pace of outdoor work would slow. People would rest during the hottest part of the day, seeking shade and cool water, waiting for the afternoon when work could resume. In the evening, as the sun descended and the heat began to lift from the land, there would be a final period of work before darkness fell and activity ceased. The work itself was necessary and constant. A farmer could never simply decide to rest for an extended period. The land required constant attention. The water channels needed to be maintained. The weeds needed to be pulled from among the growing crops. A woman's work was no less constant. Grinding grain by hand was a time-consuming task that had to be done regularly to produce flour for bread. Spinning and weaving were never-ending tasks that had to be fit in around the demands of caring for children and preparing food. The rhythm of life was set by the demands of survival, by the endless cycle of work that was necessary to produce enough food, enough cloth, enough of the necessities of life to keep a family fed and clothed through the year. Yet within this hard routine, there was also time for rest and pleasure. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the sun had set, families would gather to eat together. The meal would typically be a simple one: bread, onions, perhaps some dates or other fruit, beer or water. But it was also a time when the family gathered, when stories could be told, when the events of the day could be discussed. On festival days, there would be more elaborate food, meat from sacrifices, better beer, fruits and sweets that were normally beyond the reach of ordinary families. There would be music and celebration. People would gather in public spaces to listen to musicians and singers, to watch processions and ceremonies, to be part of something larger than their individual families and concerns. And in these public spaces, in these moments of gathering and celebration, the stories of the gods and the cosmos would be recited and sung. A skilled singer, trained in the art of composition and performance, might recite long passages from the great mythological texts, adapted and performed in a way that was engaging to the audience, that could hold the attention of people gathered on a warm evening. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth, though not as immediately entertaining as some other mythological narratives, would have been part of this repertoire, would have been known to anyone who regularly participated in public gatherings and listened to professional entertainers. The understanding of the Igigi as separated beings, confined to the sky, unable to reach the earth, this understanding would have carried a certain weight of meaning for people living in a civilization that was acutely aware of boundaries and boundaries maintenance. Sumer itself was bordered by deserts and mountains, by regions controlled by other peoples, by an external world that was understood as dangerous and chaotic. Sumerian civilization saw itself as a kind of order imposed on chaos, a system that had to be constantly maintained and protected against the forces that would destroy it. The walls of cities, the irrigation systems, the hierarchical organization of society, these were all expressions of the principle that order had to be actively maintained, that boundaries had to be drawn and defended. In this context, the separation of the Igigi from the earth took on a resonance that went beyond the purely theological. It spoke to something that the Sumerian people understood intuitively, that there were things that belonged in certain places and things that did not belong elsewhere, that the universe functioned properly only when these boundaries were maintained, that there could be chaos and disorder if boundaries were violated. The Igigi, confined to the sky, unable to reach the earth, were an example of proper cosmic order, of beings existing in their correct places, of a boundary that was maintained and functional. The tablet that recorded this separation, then, was not merely a record of something that had happened in the distant past. It was understood as an ongoing document, a statement that needed to be repeatedly affirmed and reasserted. Each generation of scribes copied it out anew, not as an antiquarian exercise, but as a renewal of the cosmic boundary itself. Each time a priest recited the words of separation, each time the story was told in a public gathering, the boundary was reinforced, the order was maintained, the cosmos continued to function as it should. This was the texture of life in Sumerian civilization at its height, a constant interweaving of practical necessity and cosmic meaning, a civilization that understood work and ritual not as separate realms, but as expressions of the same fundamental principle. The farmer working his fields was, in a sense, participating in the cosmic order. The scribe copying out the text of the tablet was not merely preserving information, but actively maintaining the very structure of the universe. The singer who recited the story of the Igigi to a gathered crowd was not merely entertaining, but was engaged in a crucial task of cultural and cosmic maintenance. And underneath all of this, in the layers of tradition that had been handed down from generation to generation, in the accumulated texts that rested in temple libraries, in the knowledge that lived in the minds of trained scribes and priests, there was a sense of continuity, of preservation, of things that had been done and said in the distant past, continuing to matter, to have power, to shape the present. The Sumerian civilization understood itself as a guardian of ancient knowledge, a civilization that had been granted access to truths that had been known since the beginning of time, and that had the responsibility to preserve and transmit those truths to future generations. The separation of the Igigi from the earth was one of those ancient truths, a fact about the structure of the cosmos that had always been true, that was always important, that needed to be continually reaffirmed and remembered. And the tablet that recorded this separation was the physical embodiment of this commitment to preservation and remembrance, a piece of clay that held within it a crucial piece of cosmic truth that needed to be kept safe, kept dry, kept where it could be consulted and read and copied whenever necessary. As the centuries passed in Sumerian civilization, as the cities rose and fell and rose again, as kings came to power and passed it on to their successors, as scribes were trained and worked and eventually died and were replaced by new scribes, the tablet remained. It was copied and recopied. It was moved when temples were rebuilt or when cities were threatened. It was consulted by scholars, cited in debates about the proper interpretation of cosmic law, treated with great respect and deference as a crucial document. And it carried forward through the centuries the message that the Igigi had been separated from the earth, that this separation was permanent and absolute, that it was cosmic law and not subject to change. Yet within this civilization that seemed stable and permanent, that had achieved a high level of organization and sophistication, forces were at work that would eventually lead to transformation and change. The very success of Sumerian civilization, the growth of its cities, the accumulation of wealth and power, created new dynamics and tensions. Neighboring peoples watched the wealth and prosperity of Sumer with growing interest. At the margins of the civilization, in the semi-arid regions beyond the irrigated heartland, populations were growing, pressures were building, movements of peoples were beginning that would gradually bring new forces into contact with the established cities and established order. As the centuries of the third millennium before the Common Era progressed, Sumerian civilization found itself increasingly pressed by external forces and internal tensions. The civilization that had seemed so stable, so well-ordered, so rooted in the land and in ancient tradition, began to experience stresses that would ultimately test its fundamental structures. These pressures came from multiple directions at once, layering upon one another, creating a situation of increasing instability and uncertainty. To the north and east of Sumer lay the lands of the Akkadians, a people who spoke a Semitic language and who had gradually been moving southward and establishing settlements within and around the edges of Sumerian territory. The Akkadians were not organized as a unified civilization at first, but rather as various tribal groups and city-states that gradually became more organized and more ambitious. By the latter part of the third millennium, under the leadership of a figure known to later history as Sargon of Akkad, the Akkadians would launch a series of military campaigns that would eventually bring them into direct conflict with the Sumerian city-states and would fundamentally alter the political and cultural landscape of Mesopotamia. But the pressures on Sumerian civilization were not solely military or political. There were also environmental stresses that were beginning to make themselves felt. The irrigation systems that had been the foundation of Sumerian agricultural prosperity were showing signs of strain. Centuries of intensive irrigation had led to the accumulation of salt in the soil, making it progressively less fertile. Areas that had once been highly productive farmland were beginning to yield diminishing returns. The farmers had to work harder and harder to produce the same amount of food. The cities, which depended on agricultural surplus to support their populations, were beginning to experience food security concerns. At the same time, internal tensions were growing within and between the various Sumerian city-states. The cities that had once cooperated, or at least coexisted in a state of tense balance, were beginning to compete more aggressively with one another for control of water resources, for control of trade routes, for political and religious prestige. The cities of Lagash and Umma, in particular, engaged in a series of conflicts over the control of a shared irrigation canal and the territories surrounding it. These conflicts, recorded in texts that have survived to the present day, paint a picture of increasingly desperate competition for resources, of cities struggling to maintain their independence and their prosperity in the face of growing pressures. The temple institutions, which had been at the center of Sumerian civilization, began to experience their own internal crises. The wealth that had accumulated in the temples over centuries, the herds of cattle, the stores of grain, the precious objects of gold and lapis lazuli, became a source of attraction and temptation. Priests who had once been primarily focused on spiritual and intellectual concerns became increasingly concerned with the management and protection of this wealth. The relationship between the temples and the kings, who supposedly served as representatives of the gods on earth, began to become strained. Kings began to accumulate power and resources independently of the temples, began to control armies and levy taxes, began to make decisions without consulting the priests as they once had. In this atmosphere of growing tension and uncertainty, the texts and traditions that had been carefully preserved in the temple libraries took on new significance. The knowledge contained in the old tablets, the stories of the gods, the records of cosmic law, the descriptions of proper order and proper boundaries, these things seemed increasingly important as anchors of meaning and stability in a world that was becoming unstable. If the political and military landscape was in flux, if the environmental and economic foundations of civilization were under stress, at least the cosmic order could be relied upon to remain eternal and unchanging. And so the tablet that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth, and all the other tablets that dealt with cosmic order and divine law, became even more significant as cultural and religious touchstones. Priests and scholars would consult these texts, would discuss their meanings, would attempt to find in them guidance about how to respond to the crises of the present. Some interpreted the pressing problems as signs that the proper rituals were not being performed correctly, that the boundaries between the realms had somehow become weakened, that only a return to strict observance of the ancient ways could restore stability. Others saw the texts as warnings about what would happen if cosmic order continued to be neglected. The accounts of the Igigi and their separation from the earth, in particular, seemed to carry a kind of cautionary message. The Igigi, according to the texts, had once been able to move more freely between the realms, but because of problems that arose from this freedom, a boundary had been established, a separation had been imposed. The texts seemed to be saying that boundaries were essential, that separation was necessary for order, that any relaxation of the boundaries that maintained the cosmic order could lead to chaos and destruction. This message resonated powerfully in a civilization that was experiencing increasing chaos and a sense that the old order was under threat. During this same period, the understanding of the Igigi and their nature also began to shift slightly, to take on new dimensions. In the older texts, the Igigi had been described primarily as workers, as builders or maintainers of celestial order. But in the texts that were being composed or reinterpreted during this period of crisis, there was an increasing emphasis on the Igigi as warriors, as powerful beings who possessed great strength and who could potentially pose a threat if they were not properly constrained. This shift in emphasis may have reflected the increasing militarization of Sumerian society, as city-states competed with one another, and as external threats grew more pressing. The image of the Igigi as powerful warriors who were separated and confined by cosmic law took on a kind of metaphorical resonance. The Igigi became symbols of power that needed to be contained, of strength that needed to be directed and controlled, of forces that could not be allowed to act freely without risking chaos. Just as the Igigi were confined to the sky and forbidden from reaching the earth, so too did the various powers within Sumerian society need to be contained and directed through proper hierarchies and proper chains of command. During this period of increasing tension and stress, the text of the tablet recording the Igigi's separation from the earth was copied particularly frequently. Multiple versions were made, distributed to different temples, preserved in multiple copies so that the knowledge would not be lost if any single copy was destroyed. This intensive copying and preservation effort itself became a kind of ritual, a way of affirming and reinforcing the boundaries that the tablet recorded. Each time a scribe copied the text, he was not merely preserving information, but was actively working to maintain the cosmic order through this act of preservation and transmission. The content of the tablet and the accounts related to it also began to be scrutinized more carefully during this period. Scholars and priests would study the texts intensively, looking for hidden meanings, attempting to understand exactly what the separation of the Igigi meant and what its implications were for present circumstances. Commentaries were written, glosses were added to the margins of tablets, debates were conducted about the proper interpretation of passages. All of this activity reflected an attempt to extract from the ancient texts guidance that could be applied to the crises of the present. One area of particular concern was the question of what would happen if the boundary that separated the Igigi from the earth were somehow breached or weakened. The texts seemed to make clear that the separation was permanent and absolute, that it had been established by the highest cosmic powers and could not be reversed. But the texts also contained references to the possibility of transgression, of beings overstepping their proper boundaries, of the chaos that would result if cosmic law were violated. The question that pressed upon the minds of scholars and priests was whether the crises that Sumerian civilization was experiencing were signs that such a transgression was occurring, or whether they were simply the normal strains and stresses that all civilizations experienced. Into this atmosphere of increasing tension and uncertainty came the military campaigns of the Akkadians. Sargon of Akkad, a figure whose origins are obscure but who rose to command the armies of the city of Kish, launched a series of military campaigns that gradually brought more and more of Mesopotamia under Akkadian control. These campaigns were not quick or easy conquests. They took place over years and decades, involving repeated battles, the overthrow of established kings, the incorporation of defeated cities into a new political system. But eventually, Sargon's military might prove superior to the forces that the Sumerian cities could muster, and one by one, the great Sumerian cities fell under Akkadian control. The conquest was not experienced as a simple military defeat, followed by a new status quo. Rather, it was experienced as a kind of cultural collision, a meeting of two civilizations with different languages, different religious beliefs, different ways of organizing society. The Akkadians were impressed by the sophistication and cultural achievements of Sumer. They did not attempt to destroy or completely erase Sumerian civilization. Instead, they adopted much of what they found valuable in it. They learned to write cuneiform. They adopted many of the Sumerian gods into their own religious system. They preserved many of the institutions and practices of Sumerian civilization. Yet the Akkadian conquest was also a form of domination. The Akkadians were the rulers now, not the Sumerians. The kings were Akkadians. The generals were Akkadians. The highest positions of power and authority were held by Akkadians. The Sumerian language, which had been the language of learning and religion and government, gradually began to decline in everyday use, though it would never completely disappear and would be preserved in temple rituals and scholarly texts. The focus of power shifted away from the ancient Sumerian cities to new centers established by the Akkadians. The old order, the order that had seemed so stable and eternal to the Sumerians, had been shattered. It was during this period of conquest and transition that the question of the Igigi and their separation from the earth began to take on new dimensions and new urgency. The Akkadians had their own religious traditions, and their own understanding of the cosmos. But they were increasingly adopting and adapting Sumerian religious knowledge. The texts and tablets that the Akkadians encountered in the temples of the cities they conquered were studied and preserved, sometimes copied and sometimes commented upon. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth was one of the texts that the Akkadians found interesting and significant. From the Akkadian perspective, the separation of the Igigi could be understood as a kind of cosmic precedent for political and military dominance. Just as the Igigi had been powerful beings who had been separated and confined, so too could other powerful forces be conquered, contained, and brought under control. The separation of the Igigi thus became, from the Akkadian viewpoint, a kind of guarantee that power could be exercised, that dominance could be established and maintained, that the cosmos itself supported the principle of order imposed through the exercise of power. Yet for the Sumerians who had lived through the conquest, the meaning was somewhat different. The fall of their cities, the loss of their independence, the dominance of Akkadian rulers over Sumerian lands. These things could be understood, from the Sumerian perspective, as a sign that some boundary had been crossed, that some violation of cosmic order had occurred. Perhaps the priests and scholars who had maintained the traditions had not been vigilant enough. Perhaps the rituals had not been performed correctly. Perhaps the cosmic boundary that had been so carefully preserved in the texts had somehow become weakened. For the Sumerian priests who remained in the temples after the Akkadian conquest, the preservation and transmission of the texts describing the Igigi's separation from the earth became a form of cultural resistance. These texts represented a body of knowledge and a way of understanding the world that was distinctively Sumerian, that went back to the very roots of Sumerian civilization. By continuing to preserve these texts, by copying them, by ensuring that they were transmitted to future generations, the Sumerian priests were maintaining a connection to their past, to their identity, to a way of understanding the cosmos that had been central to their civilization. The period of Akkadian dominance was not permanent. After a few generations, the Akkadian Empire began to fragment, weakened by internal strains and pressures from external enemies. In the power vacuum that resulted, certain Sumerian cities, particularly began to reassert their independence and power. There emerged a period known as the III period, a time when Sumerian civilization experienced a kind of renaissance, when the old cities once again became centers of power and cultural importance, when the Sumerian language and traditions were once again elevated in status and prestige. During this III Renaissance, the preservation and study of the ancient texts, including the texts describing the separation of the Igigi from the earth, became even more intensive. Kings and governors invested resources in the copying and preservation of texts. Libraries were established or expanded. The training of scribes was formalized and standardized. It was during this period that many of the texts that have survived to the present day were copied, preserved in the forms in which modern scholars have encountered them. But this Renaissance was also a kind of swan song, a last flowering of a civilization that was beginning to face pressures that would ultimately prove insurmountable. To the north, the Amorite peoples were beginning to move into Mesopotamia, establishing themselves in various cities, beginning their own process of cultural adaptation and political consolidation. To the east, the Elamites were becoming more aggressive in their military campaigns, launching attacks against the cities of southern Mesopotamia. The environment, too, was continuing to change. The salinization of the soil was making agriculture progressively more difficult, and there were periods of drought that made life even more precarious. Within this context of renewal and resilience, mixed with underlying pressures and strains, the tablets and texts describing the cosmic order, the boundaries between the realms, the separation of the Igigi from the earth, took on a kind of desperate importance. These texts represented a form of knowledge and a way of understanding the world that seemed unchanging and eternal, even as the political and environmental landscape was changing and becoming increasingly unstable. The act of copying and preserving these texts became a way of affirming that there were eternal truths, that there were boundaries that could not be crossed, that there was an order to the cosmos that transcended the temporary disruptions and upheavals of human civilization. The tablet that specifically recorded the separation of the Igigi from the Earth was among the texts that received the most careful attention and the most intensive preservation efforts during this period. Multiple copies were made. The text was studied and commented upon. It was copied into new forms, adapted and preserved in ways that would ensure its survival and transmission to future generations. The message that the tablet carried, that the Igigi were separated from the Earth, that this separation was permanent and cosmic in nature, that it was recorded in written form as an eternal law, this message seemed to carry a profound significance for a civilization that was struggling to maintain its identity and its sense of cosmic order in the face of mounting pressures and challenges. Yet even as Sumerian scribes were carefully copying and preserving these texts, even as priests were performing rituals to reinforce the cosmic boundaries, the forces that would eventually lead to the end of Sumerian civilization as an independent entity were gathering strength. The civilization that had lasted for thousands of years, that had given the world writing and cities and complex systems of law and government, was entering a period of terminal decline from which there would be no recovery. The transition from the Ur-3 period to what scholars call the Old Babylonian period marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in Mesopotamian civilization. The great unified states that had briefly dominated southern Mesopotamia fragmented once more into smaller regional powers. The Amorite peoples, who had been gradually filtering into Mesopotamia over centuries, began to establish themselves more firmly in various cities. New dynasties emerged, including the dynasty that would eventually produce Hammurabi, whose reign would establish Babylon as the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. Sumerian civilization, as a political and military force, gradually ceased to exist as an independent entity, but Sumerian culture, Sumerian language, and Sumerian texts would survive far longer, preserved and transmitted by scribes and scholars who continued to value the knowledge and wisdom that these texts contained. It is crucial to understand that the decline of Sumerian political independence did not mean the immediate disappearance of Sumerian knowledge and tradition. Rather, what happened was a complex process of cultural transmission and adaptation. The peoples who conquered Sumer and established their own rule over Mesopotamia were not entirely foreign to Sumerian culture. Many of them had lived on the borders of Sumerian territory for generations, had absorbed Sumerian influence, had learned to admire and respect Sumerian civilization. When they came to power, they did not seek to erase what they found, but rather to appropriate it, to make it part of their own cultural identity. The Akkadians had already begun this process centuries earlier, and the pattern continued with the Amorite peoples and subsequent conquerors. They learned cuneiform. They adopted Sumerian gods into their own religious systems. They studied Sumerian texts and attempted to master the knowledge they contained. For a scribe seeking to establish himself as an educated man of learning, mastery of Sumerian was as important as mastery of his own native language. The great texts of Sumerian civilization, the mythological epics, the wisdom literature, the records of laws and cosmic order, became part of the shared intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia, texts that were copied and preserved by peoples of many different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. The texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth continued to be copied and studied throughout this period. The message they contained seemed to resonate across cultural boundaries. The idea that there were cosmic laws that transcended human power, that boundaries existed that could not be transgressed, that proper order depended on the maintenance of these boundaries. These ideas were not uniquely Sumerian. They were expressions of a way of understanding the cosmos that had appealed to many peoples and many cultures. During the Old Babylonian period, which lasted roughly from 2000 to 1600 before the Common Era, Mesopotamia experienced a kind of cultural flowering. Multiple cities became centers of learning and literary production. Scribal schools flourished. The great texts of Sumerian and Akkadian literature were copied repeatedly, preserved in multiple versions, studied and commented upon by scholars. It was during this period that many of the texts we know today were copied into the forms in which they have survived. The tablets that recorded the Igigi's separation from the earth, which may have been older texts going back to Sumerian origins, were among the works that received intensive copying and preservation. The scribal schools of the Old Babylonian period were important institutions where young men learned not only the practical skills of writing and accounting, but also were educated in the literary and intellectual traditions of Mesopotamia. A boy entering such a school would begin with basic instruction in recognizing and forming cuneiform signs, just as had been done in earlier periods. But he would also be trained in the interpretation of texts, in the understanding of the mythological and cosmological knowledge they contained, in the ability to discuss and debate the meanings of difficult or obscure passages. A student in such a school might spend many months copying out passages from the great mythological texts. He would copy the creation myth, the stories of the gods and their deeds, the descriptions of the cosmos and its organization. Among the texts he would be required to copy would be the accounts of the Igigi and their separation from the earth. As he copied, he would be learning not only the physical mechanics of writing, but also absorbing the content of these texts, internalizing their teachings, becoming familiar with the way of understanding the world that they represented. The teaching methods used in these schools are known to us through surviving school texts, tablets on which teachers or advanced students had written practice exercises, or fragments of compositions that were used in instruction. These texts show that the teaching process involved repetition, the copying of the same passages over and over until mastery was achieved. Teachers would sometimes correct students' work, noting errors or offering guidance. Advanced students would be asked to compose new texts or to provide commentaries on existing ones, demonstrating their understanding and their ability to work with the material they had learned. In this educational context, the texts dealing with the Igigi and cosmic boundaries were presented not merely as ancient history or mythological narrative, but as serious theological and cosmological knowledge. Students learned that the Igigi were real beings, that they had indeed been separated from the earth, that this separation was important and significant, and that understanding the reason for this separation was part of understanding how the cosmos was organized and maintained. The texts became part of a kind of shared intellectual framework within which educated men understood themselves and their world. As the centuries of the Old Babylonian period progressed, multiple copies of the texts dealing with the Igigi had accumulated in temple archives and scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia. When one copy became worn or damaged from repeated handling and reading, it could be replaced with a new copy made by a scribe. When a temple or a school needed a copy of a text, a scribe would be commissioned to produce one, copying from an existing exemplar with as much care and accuracy as he could manage. In this way, the texts were continuously renewed and refreshed, even as they maintained their basic form and content. But this process of copying and preservation, while generally successful in maintaining the basic text, also allowed for variations and alterations to creep in. A scribe working quickly might make small errors in copying. A scribe seeking to improve or clarify a text might deliberately alter a phrase. A scribe might add a note in the margin, and a later scribe might incorporate this note into the main text itself. Over time, through many cycles of copying, texts could accumulate variations and sometimes develop multiple versions, with some copies preserving older forms of the text and other copies showing the effects of later alterations and additions. The texts dealing with the Igigi underwent this kind of gradual evolution during the Old Babylonian period and beyond. The basic narrative remained relatively stable. The Igigi were separated from the earth. The separation was permanent. It was recorded in cosmic law. But the details of the accounts might vary. Some versions emphasized certain aspects of the story while downplaying others. Some versions added explanatory material or commentary that had not been present in earlier versions. Some versions preserved very archaic language and concepts, while others showed evidence of being updated or reinterpreted in light of later theological developments. During this same period, the understanding of the Igigi was also being influenced by contact with other cultures and other ways of thinking about the cosmos. As Mesopotamia became increasingly cosmopolitan, as peoples of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds lived together, exchanged ideas, and influenced one another, new elements were incorporated into the traditional cosmologies. The Igigi were sometimes understood as beings who had connections to other divine figures, worshipped by other peoples. The cosmic boundaries and separations that had been understood in a purely Mesopotamian context were sometimes reinterpreted in light of broader theological concepts. The relationship between the Igigi and the underworld, for example, became a subject of increasing attention during this period. Earlier texts had sometimes distinguished between the Igigi, who were associated with the sky and the upper realms, and the Anunnaki proper, who were associated with the underworld. But later texts began to explore the connections between these different groups of beings to suggest that they might be different aspects of a unified divine bureaucracy, that they worked together to maintain the order of the cosmos. These elaborations suggested an even more complex and sophisticated understanding of the cosmic hierarchy and the roles that different beings played in maintaining the cosmic order. The tablet or tablets that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth were situated within this evolving context of textual transmission and theological interpretation. As new copies were made, as commentaries were written, as the text was studied and discussed by scholars, the understanding of what the separation meant gradually deepened and became more complex. Some scholars focused on the practical implications. The separation meant that the Igigi could not interfere in earthly affairs, that humans did not need to fear direct action from these beings, that the boundary between the celestial and terrestrial realms was secure. Other scholars focused on the theological implications. The separation demonstrated that cosmic order was maintained through law and boundary, that even the greatest powers submitted to these laws, that the universe operated according to principles that were rational and comprehensible. Around 1600 before the Common Era, the Old Babylonian period came to an end. Political upheaval and the invasion of the Hittites and other foreign peoples led to a period of fragmentation and decline. The great cities that had flourished during the Old Babylonian period were damaged or destroyed. The networks of trade and communication that had connected them began to break down. This period, which lasted for several centuries, is sometimes called the Dark Age of Mesopotamia, because it was a time when written records become sparse and our historical knowledge becomes more uncertain. Yet even during this period of disruption, the preservation of texts continued. Temples, though damaged and impoverished, maintained whatever libraries they could. Scribes, though fewer in number and less well supported than they had been during the more prosperous periods, continued to copy texts, to preserve knowledge, to transmit traditions. The texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth were among those that survived this difficult period, preserved by priests and scholars who understood them to be important parts of the cultural and religious heritage of Mesopotamia. Eventually, around 1450 before the Common Era, the land of Mesopotamia began to recover from this period of disruption. The city of Babylon, under the rule of Kassite kings, emerged as the dominant power. The Kassites were foreign people who had invaded Mesopotamia, but like the Akkadians and Amorites before them, they gradually became absorbed into Mesopotamian culture. They adopted the Sumerian and Akkadian languages. They became patrons of the temples. They supported the preservation and copying of texts. The temples, rebuilt and reestablished, once again became centers of learning and religious practice. It was during the Kassite period that the great temple library of Nippur, one of the most important religious centers of Mesopotamia, was rebuilt and restocked with texts. The efforts made to reconstruct this library are remarkable. Scribes worked to locate and copy texts that had been partially lost or were in danger of being lost, to ensure that the knowledge they contained would be preserved. The texts dealing with the cosmic order, the boundaries between the realms, and the separation of the Igigi from the earth were among those that received this careful attention and preservation. During this same period, there was also an increasing effort to create standardized versions of important texts, rather than allowing each temple or school to maintain its own, somewhat different version of a text. efforts were made to establish an agreed-upon canonical version that could be copied and distributed. This process of standardization was not always successful. Different versions continued to exist, and scribes sometimes chose to preserve older or alternative versions rather than adopting the standardized version. But the effort to standardize showed an awareness that written texts were important repositories of knowledge that needed to be carefully preserved and transmitted. The Kassite period lasted for several centuries, and it was a time of relative stability and prosperity for Mesopotamia. The great cities were rebuilt, trade networks were reestablished, cultural life flourished. The temples accumulated wealth and resources once more, and they invested these resources in maintaining and expanding their libraries, in supporting scribes and scholars, in preserving the texts that contained the knowledge that Mesopotamian civilization valued. The texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth continued to be copied, studied, and preserved as part of this broader effort to maintain and transmit Mesopotamian cultural knowledge. However, the Kassite period was also a time during which Mesopotamia was being drawn into a larger geopolitical sphere that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of Mesopotamian civilization. The rise of great empires in Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, and other regions meant that Mesopotamia was increasingly subject to external pressures and influences. Trade networks extended farther than they had before, bringing new peoples and new ideas into contact with Mesopotamian civilization. This increasing cosmopolitanism had the effect of spreading Mesopotamian culture, including the texts and traditions about the Igigi, beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia itself. Scribes and scholars from other lands began to learn cuneiform, to study Mesopotamian texts, to incorporate Mesopotamian ideas into their own intellectual and religious traditions. The story of the separation of the Igigi from the earth, preserved in Mesopotamian texts, became known to peoples beyond Mesopotamia. It was studied in distant temples. It was copied by foreign scribes. It was incorporated into the religious understanding of peoples who had no historical connection to Sumer or to the original creators of the text. This process of cultural transmission and dispersal was not rapid or dramatic. It happened gradually, over centuries, as networks of communication and exchange slowly developed and expanded. But it meant that the knowledge contained in the tablet recording the Igigi's separation from the earth was no longer confined to Mesopotamia. It began to spread, to be adapted, to be incorporated into other cultural and religious systems. The text that had originated in Sumerian temples, that had been preserved and transmitted through centuries of Mesopotamian history, was beginning to take on a life of its own, becoming part of a broader, ancient Near Eastern intellectual heritage. As the second millennium before the Common Era drew toward its close, a new power began to emerge in the north of Mesopotamia. The Assyrian kingdom, centered in the city of Ashur on the Tigris River, gradually expanded its influence and eventually its direct control over an increasingly large territory. The Assyrians were not entirely new to the historical stage. The city of Ashur had existed for centuries and had been the center of a minor kingdom. But beginning around 1365 before the Common Era, under rulers like Ashurbanipal and his successors, Assyria began to expand aggressively, conquering neighboring territories and incorporating them into an increasingly centralized state. The Assyrian expansion was not a simple military conquest, followed by absorption of conquered peoples. Rather, the Assyrians developed sophisticated systems of administration that allowed them to control vast territories with diverse populations. They established a professional standing army. They built roads and fortifications. They organized the population into systems of taxation and service. They were also intensely interested in learning from the peoples they conquered. The Assyrians eagerly adopted Mesopotamian culture, learning cuneiform, studying the great texts of Mesopotamian literature and learning, incorporating Mesopotamian gods into their own religious system while maintaining their own distinctive cultural identity. One of the most significant developments of the Assyrian period was the creation of the Great Library at Nineveh, the royal capital that the Assyrian king Sennacherib had established in the late 8th century before the Common Era. Under the reign of Sennacherib's grandson, Ashurbanipal, this library was expanded and organized into a comprehensive collection of the literary, scientific, religious, and administrative knowledge of Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal was himself a scholar and a man of learning, and he directed the library project with great care and attention. He commissioned scribes to search out important texts, to copy them, to bring them to Nineveh so that they could be preserved in his library. The scale of this effort was enormous. Thousands of tablets and fragments of tablets were brought to Nineveh and organized according to subject matter. The library contained mythological texts, including the great epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish. It contained administrative documents, letters, legal texts, and scientific works on astronomy and mathematics. It contained religious texts, hymns to the gods, and texts dealing with omens and divination, and it contained the tablets dealing with cosmic order and cosmology, including the texts that describe the separation of the Igigi from the earth. The preservation efforts undertaken at Nineveh were incredibly comprehensive. Scribes did not merely copy texts once and consider the work done. Instead, they made multiple copies of important texts, ensuring that even if one copy was damaged or lost, others would survive. They made systematic efforts to track down all known versions of important texts, to ensure that nothing of value was overlooked or lost. They standardized texts where possible, creating canonical versions that could be reliably copied and distributed. They added colophons to many tablets, notes that identified the text, recorded who had copied it and when, and often contained a prayer or curse that was meant to encourage future scribes to preserve and respect the text. The tablets dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth received careful attention as part of this preservation effort. Multiple copies were made and added to the library at Nineveh. These copies were clearly identified and organized so that they could be consulted alongside related texts that dealt with cosmic order and the organization of the divine realm. The fact that multiple copies were made and that they were carefully organized and preserved tells us something important about how the Assyrians understood the significance of these texts. They were not treated as minor or obscure documents, but as important parts of the knowledge that any truly educated person should understand. The library at Nineveh was destroyed when the city fell to an alliance of Medes and Babylonians in 612 before the Common Era, bringing an end to Assyrian political power. But the destruction was not complete. The clay tablets survived. They were buried under the rubble and ashes of the destroyed city, sealed away from the air and moisture that might have damaged them. There they would remain for more than 2,500 years, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century of the Common Era. But before the library at Nineveh was destroyed, the preservation efforts undertaken there had already ensured the survival of the texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth. The multiple copies made during Ashurbanipal's reign and the careful preservation and organization of these copies meant that the knowledge they contained would eventually make its way to the modern world. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s, they found thousands of tablets, including multiple copies of the texts dealing with the Igigi. These tablets would eventually be transported to museums in Europe, where they could be studied by scholars who had learned to read cuneiform. However, the preservation of these texts during the Assyrian period was not merely a matter of physical preservation, of ensuring that clay tablets survived. It was also a matter of intellectual and spiritual preservation, of ensuring that the knowledge and understanding contained in the texts was kept alive, that it continued to be understood and valued by educated people, that it remained part of the living intellectual tradition of Mesopotamian civilization, even as that civilization was being transformed and eventually superseded by others. During the Assyrian period, the scribal schools continued to operate, much as they had in earlier periods, but with increasing systematization and standardization. Young men selected for training in the scribal arts would be educated in the knowledge that was considered essential for an educated Mesopotamian. They would learn cuneiform, but they would also learn the content of the great texts. They would study the myths and the stories. They would learn the principles of cosmic order. They would be trained in the interpretation of omens and the performance of rituals. Among the texts they would study would be those dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth. For an Assyrian scribe, understanding the story of the Igigi and what it meant carried particular resonance. Assyria was an empire that had risen to power through military conquest and that maintained its power through the exercise of force. The story of powerful beings being separated and confined, being brought under cosmic law and forced to respect boundaries, had an appeal to Assyrian rulers and the educated men who served them. It seemed to provide a cosmic sanction for the principle that order could be imposed through the exercise of power, that boundaries could be established and maintained, that even the greatest powers had to submit to law and order. Moreover, the Assyrians understood themselves as the instruments of divine will, as agents of the god Ashur, who had chosen them to rule and to maintain order in the known world. The story of the Igigi being separated from the earth fit into this understanding. It showed that cosmic order required the separation of realms, the maintenance of boundaries, the prevention of disorder. The Assyrians, in maintaining their own ordered system of control and administration, understood themselves as participating in a cosmic principle, as maintaining on earth the kind of order that the gods maintained in the heavens. During the Assyrian period, the texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth were also subject to new forms of interpretation and commentary. Assyrian scholars added notes and glosses to the texts, offering their own understanding of what the texts meant. These commentaries showed a sophisticated level of engagement with the material, demonstrating that the texts were not simply received passively, but were actively interpreted and understood in light of contemporary concerns and perspectives. One particularly important development during the Assyrian period was the increasing attention to the question of what exactly the tablets that recorded the separation of the Igigi actually said. Scholars began to examine the oldest versions of the text they could find, attempting to reconstruct what the original text had said before it had been copied and recopied over centuries. This kind of textual criticism, the attempt to determine the original form of a text by comparing different versions, was not something that had been systematically done in earlier periods, but it became an increasingly important part of Assyrian scholarship. This effort at textual reconstruction was driven by the understanding that the original text, the oldest version that could be recovered, was likely to be the most authoritative. If a text had been copied and recopied over centuries, small errors and changes might have accumulated. By comparing different versions and attempting to identify and correct these errors, scholars believed they could recover something closer to the original intention of the ancient writer. For texts dealing with cosmic law and cosmic order, this seemed particularly important. The original text was understood to contain the truest and most authoritative statement of cosmic truth. The Assyrian efforts at textual preservation and reconstruction had the effect of fixing certain texts in forms that would be transmitted to later periods with relatively little change. The standardized versions created during the Assyrian period, particularly those that were incorporated into the library at Nineveh, became the versions that would be most widely copied and preserved. Later scribes, lacking access to other versions, would copy from these Assyrian versions, and thus the Assyrian versions would come to be the most common and most well-known forms of these texts. It is partly because of these Assyrian preservation efforts that we know what we know about the separation of the Igigi from the earth today, the multiple copies made during Ashurbanipal's reign, the careful organization and preservation of these copies, the efforts at textual standardization and reconstruction. All of these contributed to ensuring that the texts survived, that they were transmitted to the modern world, and that they are available to us now for study and interpretation. Yet even as the Assyrians were making these intensive efforts to preserve the texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth, the civilization that had created these texts was approaching its end. The Sumerian civilization that had originated these stories, that had first committed them to writing on clay tablets, was long gone. The Akkadian civilization that had adopted and adapted the stories had also passed away. The Babylonian and Kassite civilizations that had preserved and studied the texts had faded into history. Now the Assyrians, the last great empire of ancient Mesopotamia, were also approaching the end of their dominance. Within a few decades of the fall of Nineveh in 612 before the Common Era, Mesopotamia would be conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great. This conquest would bring the era of independent Mesopotamian civilization to an end. The cuneiform script, which had been used to write Mesopotamian languages for 3,000 years, would gradually fall out of use. The temples that had preserved the texts and the scribal traditions would decline in importance. Within a few centuries, no one would be able to read cuneiform anymore, and the knowledge contained in the thousands of clay tablets would be sealed away, inaccessible, lost until the day when modern scholars would once again learn to read the ancient script and recover the messages that the tablets contained. But in that final moment before the end, in the library at Nineveh, multiple copies of the tablets dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth were carefully preserved, organized, and cataloged. These copies would survive the destruction of the city, would survive the end of Mesopotamian civilization, would survive millennia of being buried in the earth. They would eventually be discovered by archaeologists, would be studied by scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding the ancient world, and would be made available to the modern reader who seeks to understand what the ancients believed about the separation of powerful beings from the realm of humanity. The preservation of these texts through the Assyrian period thus represented a kind of triumph of human knowledge over the forces of time and change. Though the civilizations that had created the texts passed away, though the languages fell out of use, though the religious and cultural systems that had valued and transmitted the texts were transformed and replaced, the physical objects themselves, the clay tablets, endured, and the knowledge they contained endured with them, waiting in silence to be discovered and understood by those who would come in later ages. For more than 2,000 years, the clay tablets that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth lay buried beneath the soil of Mesopotamia. The library of Nineveh, destroyed in 612 before the Common Era, was sealed under rubble and ash. The other temple archives and scribal schools that had preserved copies of these texts were damaged, destroyed, or simply abandoned as cuneiform fell out of use, and the knowledge of how to read it was lost. The texts became inaccessible, not through any deliberate act of suppression, but simply through the passage of time and the transformation of civilizations. The land of Mesopotamia continued to be inhabited after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, but the new peoples who lived there had different languages, different writing systems, different ways of understanding the world. They did not use cuneiform anymore. They did not read the old Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The tablets lay in the earth, in some cases deliberately buried by priests attempting to preserve them, in other cases simply lost as buildings collapsed and were buried under new structures built on top of the ruins. The knowledge that these tablets contained was effectively lost to human memory, surviving only in fragments and echoes in later texts written in Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and other languages that had come to dominate the region. It was not until the 19th century of the Common Era that serious efforts were made to excavate and study the sites of ancient Mesopotamian cities. European scholars and adventurers, inspired by the discoveries of ancient Egyptian texts and monuments that were being made at the same time, began to explore the great mounds that rose above the flat plains of Iraq, mounds that marked the locations of cities that had been abandoned more than 2,000 years before. The excavations were often crude by modern standards, conducted with little systematic care, and much valuable information was lost because the excavators did not have the knowledge to properly document what they were finding. But they did succeed in uncovering thousands of clay tablets, including many that had been part of the Great Library at Nineveh. The first major excavations of the library at Nineveh were conducted by an explorer named Austin Henry Layard, beginning in the 1840s. Layard was not a trained archaeologist. Such a profession barely existed at that time. But he was a skilled observer and a man of considerable intelligence and learning. He worked systematically to uncover the ruins of the Assyrian royal palace and to search for and recover the tablets that lay within or beneath it. His work was not always conducted with the care that modern archaeologists would demand, but it was successful in recovering a massive collection of tablets, many of which were subsequently transported to the British Museum in London. Among the tablets that Layard and his successors uncovered were many copies of the great mythological and religious texts of Mesopotamia, including multiple copies of texts dealing with the cosmic order and the place of the Igigi within that order. These tablets, made of clay pressed with cuneiform signs, were carefully preserved and transported to Europe, where they could be studied by scholars who were beginning to learn the ancient language of the signs. The decipherment of cuneiform was itself a major intellectual achievement that took place over several decades in the 19th century. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, which had been deciphered with the aid of the Rosetta Stone, cuneiform had no such convenient key. Instead, scholars had to work through a process of comparative study, analyzing the structure of the signs, making educated guesses about what sounds they represented, comparing different texts to identify patterns and recurring elements. Key figures in this work included Henry Creswick Rawlinson, who made major progress in deciphering the Old Persian and Akkadian versions of cuneiform, and Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman who made crucial contributions to understanding the structure of the Akkadian language. By the mid-19th century, scholars had made enough progress in deciphering cuneiform that they could begin to translate the tablets that had been recovered from Nineveh. The process of translation was slow and painstaking. Many words were ambiguous, many grammatical structures were unclear, and the cultural context in which the text had been written was unfamiliar to modern readers. But gradually, over the course of decades, the meaning of the texts began to emerge. The stories of the creation of the world, the deeds of the gods, the organization of the cosmos. These ancient narratives became accessible to modern readers for the first time in more than 2,000 years. Among the texts that scholars worked to translate were those dealing with the cosmic order and the separation of the Igigi from the earth. These texts were more difficult to understand than some of the mythological narratives because they dealt with more abstract theological concepts and because they often contained passages that were fragmentary or unclear. But scholars persevered, and gradually a picture began to emerge of what the ancient Mesopotamians had believed about the Igigi and about their separation from the realm of humanity. One of the most important figures in the study of Mesopotamian texts was a scholar named George Smith. In 1872, while examining tablets in the British Museum, Smith made a remarkable discovery. While reading a tablet that he had been studying, he suddenly realized that the text contained a narrative of a great flood, a narrative that bore striking similarities to the biblical account of Noah's flood. Smith became so excited by this discovery that he is said to have stood up and begun to take off his clothes, exclaiming in wonder at what he had found. Though this particular account may be apocryphal, the story illustrates the excitement that the decipherment of cuneiform texts generated among 19th century scholars. Smith's discovery of the flood narrative in the Mesopotamian texts led to a broader scholarly interest in exploring connections between ancient Mesopotamian texts and biblical narratives. As more and more tablets were translated, scholars began to identify other parallels and connections. They found that many biblical concepts and narratives had parallels in much earlier Mesopotamian sources. This discovery had profound implications for biblical scholarship, and it led to a broader recognition that the ancient Near East had been a region of interconnected cultures, with ideas and influences flowing back and forth across political and linguistic boundaries. The texts dealing with the separation of the Igigi from the earth did not generate quite the same level of immediate popular interest as the flood narrative or the creation myths, but they were carefully studied by scholars working on Mesopotamian religion and cosmology. These scholars recognized that the texts were important for understanding how the ancient Mesopotamians had conceptualized cosmic order, how they had understood the relationship between divine beings and human beings, and how they had made sense of the universe in which they lived. As the 20th century progressed, the study of Mesopotamian texts became increasingly sophisticated. New methods of analysis were developed. More tablets were excavated. Scholars began to understand more deeply the historical context in which the texts had been created, and the ways in which they had been modified and reinterpreted over time. The picture of Mesopotamian civilization and Mesopotamian thought became increasingly complex and nuanced. One important development was the recognition that many of the texts that had been discovered were not original compositions, but copies of much older texts. By comparing different versions of the same text, by studying the language and style of different copies, by examining the colophons and other identifying marks on the tablets, scholars could often determine approximately when a particular copy had been made, and sometimes could identify which scribe had made the copy. This work of textual analysis allowed scholars to trace the history of individual texts over centuries or even millennia, to see how the understanding and interpretation of texts had changed over time, and to identify the oldest layers of textual material that could be recovered. In the case of the texts dealing with the separation of the Igigi from the earth, this kind of textual analysis was particularly revealing. Some of the copies that had been discovered appeared to be quite old, containing language and concepts that seemed to go back to the Sumerian period. Other copies appeared to be younger, showing evidence of later interpretation and elaboration. By studying these different versions, scholars could begin to reconstruct something of the history of how the story of the Igigi's separation from the earth had been understood, how it had been interpreted, how it had been modified and expanded over time. A particularly important contribution to the study of these texts was made by scholars who were able to identify and study the fragmentary remains of tablets that contained parts of the same compositions. A single composition, such as one of the great myths or epics, might be written on a series of tablets, with each tablet containing one section of the narrative. When tablets from the same composition were broken apart, the fragments might end up in different museums or collections. By identifying these fragments and bringing them together, scholars could reconstruct the full text of compositions that had only been partially preserved. The work of identifying and studying these fragments was painstaking and often frustrating, but it was also often rewarding, because it could lead to the recovery of texts that had been thought to be permanently lost. In the case of some of the texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth, the recovery of fragments from different tablets allowed scholars to reconstruct longer and more complete versions of the accounts than would have been available from a single tablet alone. By the middle of the 20th century, after more than a century of excavation, translation, and scholarly analysis, a reasonably clear picture had emerged of what the Mesopotamian texts had to say about the Igigi and their separation from the earth. The texts made clear that the Igigi were understood as powerful beings who had once had the ability to move between the sky and the earth. But a boundary had been established, a separation had been imposed, and this separation was understood to be permanent and cosmic in nature. The tablet that recorded this separation was understood to be a document of fundamental importance, a record of cosmic law that had to be carefully preserved and transmitted. However, it was also clear that the existing texts were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Different texts emphasized different aspects of the story. Some texts focused on the separation itself and on the permanence of the boundary. Other texts appeared to focus on the reasons for the separation or on the circumstances that had led to it. Some texts seemed to preserve older material that was not fully understood, even by the later copyists who had transmitted the texts. The full meaning and significance of the separation of the Igigi from the earth could not be determined with certainty from the surviving texts alone. This recognition, that the texts were incomplete and sometimes ambiguous, did not diminish the efforts of scholars to understand them. Rather, it intensified those efforts. Scholars became more careful in their analysis, more precise in their translations, more cautious in drawing conclusions about what the texts meant. They recognized that they were working with fragments of a tradition that had been created and transmitted over thousands of years, and that some of what the tradition had originally meant might be forever lost to us, or might only be recoverable through careful and painstaking analysis. The 20th century also saw the development of new scholarly tools and methods that could be applied to the study of ancient texts. Computers began to be used to search large databases of translated texts to identify patterns and parallels that would have been difficult or impossible to identify by hand. Linguistic analysis became increasingly sophisticated, allowing scholars to understand more deeply how ancient languages had worked and what meanings words could carry. Archaeological methods became more systematic and more careful, so that new excavations could recover not only texts, but also detailed information about the context in which those texts had been found. One important archaeological project that contributed significantly to the study of Mesopotamian texts was the systematic re-excavation of the site of Nippur, one of the most important religious centers of ancient Mesopotamia. Excavations at Nippur, particularly those conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, recovered numerous tablets from the temple archives and the scribal schools that had existed at that site. Many of these tablets were copies of important texts that had also been found at other sites, and the availability of these multiple versions allowed scholars to do the kind of textual comparison that was so important for understanding how texts had been transmitted and interpreted over time. As scholars worked to understand the texts dealing with the Igigi and their separation from the earth, they also became interested in understanding what these texts meant to the ancient peoples who had created and transmitted them. What did it mean to the Sumerians to have a text that recorded that certain powerful beings had been permanently separated from the earth? What theological significance did this separation carry? How did it relate to other aspects of Mesopotamian religious and philosophical thought? These questions led scholars to examine the texts in a broader context, to understand them not as isolated narratives, but as part of a larger system of theological and cosmological understanding. Scholars studied the relationships between the texts, dealing with the Igigi, and other texts dealing with cosmic order, with the nature of divine beings, with the organization of the universe. They examined the ways in which different theological concepts were woven together to create a comprehensive understanding of how the cosmos worked and what place humanity had within that cosmos. Through this process of careful scholarly analysis, pursued over more than a century and continuing into the present day, the message of the tablets recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth has been gradually recovered and understood. These ancient clay objects, created by scribes in temples and palaces thousands of years ago, have been brought back to life in the understanding of modern readers. The knowledge they contain, sealed away for millennia, has been opened and made accessible to anyone who wishes to study it. As scholars have worked to translate and understand the tablets dealing with the separation of the Igigi from the earth, a number of interpretative questions have emerged that have occupied considerable scholarly attention. The texts themselves, while relatively clear in their basic narrative outline, are often elliptical about the reasons for the separation, the circumstances that made it necessary, and the precise nature of the boundary that was established. This ambiguity has meant that different scholars, working with the same texts, have sometimes reached different conclusions about what the texts ultimately mean. One central interpretative question concerns the historical reality or mythological status of the Igigi. When the Mesopotamian texts speak of the Igigi being separated from the earth, are they referring to actual beings who once existed and who were literally separated through some cosmic event? Or are they speaking metaphorically, using the figure of separation to represent some abstract theological principle? Modern scholars have approached this question from different angles, and there is no complete consensus about the answer. Some scholars have argued that the Igigi should be understood as primarily mythological beings, as figures in a symbolic cosmology, rather than as literal entities that actually existed. From this perspective, the separation of the Igigi from the earth can be understood as a way of expressing the theological truth that the realm of the divine and the realm of the human are fundamentally different and must remain separated. The boundary between them is not primarily a physical boundary, but rather a boundary of nature and essence. Divine beings and human beings are different kinds of entities with different capacities and different roles, and this fundamental difference must be maintained for proper cosmic order. Other scholars, while acknowledging the mythological and symbolic dimensions of the texts, have suggested that they may also contain echoes of historical memories, that the stories about the Igigi and their separation from the earth might be based on actual events or actual encounters with beings that were not fully understood by those who encountered them. From this perspective, the text might preserve, in mythological form, memories of something that happened in the ancient past, perhaps the departure of a group of beings who had lived among humans, or perhaps the establishment of a boundary or restriction that was understood as separating different kinds of beings. A third interpretative approach, which has been developed more recently by scholars interested in understanding how ancient peoples thought about the relationship between the material and the divine, suggests that the separation of the Igigi from the earth might be understood as a kind of cosmic law or principle, rather than as a specific event that happened at a particular time. From this perspective, the separation was not something that happened once and was then complete, but rather an ongoing principle that had to be continually maintained and reinforced. The act of writing down the separation on the tablet was not merely recording a past event, but was itself an act of cosmic maintenance, a way of ensuring that the separation remained in force. What all of these interpretative approaches have in common is the recognition that the texts dealing with the Igigi are concerned with boundaries, with the maintenance of separations, with the proper organization of the cosmos according to principles that can be stated and understood. Regardless of whether one interprets the Igigi as literal beings or as mythological figures, regardless of whether one understands the separation as a historical event or as a metaphorical expression of theological truth, the texts are clearly asserting that proper cosmic order depends on maintaining boundaries, on keeping different kinds of beings and different realms separate from one another. One particularly fruitful area of scholarly interpretation has involved studying the relationship between the texts about the Igigi and other Mesopotamian texts that deal with cosmic order and cosmic law. The great creation myth known as the Enuma Elish, for example, contains accounts of how cosmic order was established in the aftermath of a great conflict among the gods. The text describes how different divine powers were assigned different roles and placed in different positions within a newly established cosmic hierarchy. Some scholars have argued that the account of the separation of the Igigi from the earth should be understood as part of the same process of establishing cosmic order, as one of the decisions or arrangements made by the great gods to ensure that the cosmos would function properly. Similarly, other texts that deal with the underworld, with the realm of the dead, and with the boundaries between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, have been studied in conjunction with the texts about the Igigi. Some scholars have noted that the Igigi, in their function as separated beings confined to the sky, have a kind of parallel relationship to the dead, who are confined to the underworld. Both groups of beings are separated from the realm of the living earth, both are prevented from freely entering the world of human activity, and both separations are maintained through cosmic law. This parallel has led some scholars to suggest that the separation of the Igigi and the separation of the dead might be understood as expressions of a single underlying principle, the principle that the cosmos is organized into distinct realms, and that proper order depends on maintaining the boundaries between these realms. Another important area of interpretation concerns the question of what the tablet itself represents, and what it means that the separation of the Igigi was recorded in written form. In Mesopotamian thought, the written word was understood as having a kind of power, as being more than merely a record of information. To write something down was, in a sense, to make it real, to create a kind of reality through the act of writing. The tablets that recorded laws, for example, were not merely descriptions of laws. They were understood as the embodiment of the laws themselves, as objects that contained and preserved the laws. Similarly, the tablet that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth would have been understood not merely as a record of a separation that had occurred, but as the embodiment of the separation itself, as an object that contained and preserved the cosmic principle of separation. This understanding of the power of the written word in Mesopotamian thought helps to explain the enormous care that was taken to preserve and transmit the texts dealing with the Igigi. The preservation of the tablet was not merely a matter of preserving historical information for future generations. Rather, it was understood as a matter of maintaining the cosmic order itself. By preserving the tablet, by copying it, by ensuring that its message continued to be known and respected, the priestly scholars were believed to be actively maintaining the separation of the Igigi from the earth, ensuring that the boundary remained in place and remained effective. Some scholars have also noted that the emphasis on the written documentation of the separation of the Igigi is itself significant. The fact that the separation had to be recorded on a tablet suggests that there was something about the separation that required explicit documentation, that could not be maintained merely through custom or tradition or implicit understanding. This might suggest that the separation was something that was not immediately obvious, that required explanation, that might be subject to misunderstanding or forgetting if it were not explicitly recorded. The need to write down the separation thus becomes itself a kind of evidence that the separation was not a self-evident or automatically maintained boundary, but rather something that had to be actively asserted and maintained through conscious effort. Another dimension of interpretation concerns the question of what would happen if the separation of the Igigi from the earth were to be violated or breached. The texts themselves do not explicitly address this question, but some scholars have inferred from the texts that a breach of the separation would lead to chaos, disorder, and a breaking down of the proper functioning of the cosmos. The separation is presented in the texts as absolute and unbreakable, and this absoluteness implies that any attempt to breach it would result in catastrophic consequences. This understanding of the dire consequences of a breach of the cosmic boundary may help to explain why the separation was regarded as being so important, and why so much effort was devoted to preserving and maintaining the knowledge of the separation. From a theological perspective, some scholars have interpreted the separation of the Igigi as expressing a fundamental insight about the nature of divine power and cosmic order. The insight seems to be that divine power is not arbitrary, that it is not subject merely to the will of individual divine beings, but rather that it is governed by laws and principles that are binding even on the gods. The separation of the Igigi from the earth is thus not merely a punishment or restriction imposed by the great gods on lesser beings, but rather it is an expression of a cosmic principle that transcends the will of any individual being, that binds all beings, that ensures that the cosmos operates according to rational principles that can be understood and articulated. This understanding of cosmic order as being governed by principles and laws, rather than by mere divine whim, represents a significant theological development. It suggests that the Mesopotamian thinkers who created and transmitted these texts were attempting to move beyond a kind of naive polytheism, in which gods were understood as arbitrary and capricious beings, toward a more sophisticated theological vision in which even divine power is constrained by and subject to cosmic law. The tablet that records the separation of the Igigi becomes, from this perspective, a kind of cosmic constitution, a document that specifies the fundamental laws that govern the universe. Some contemporary scholars have also explored the possibility that the texts about the Igigi and their separation from the earth might have been understood in different ways by different audiences. A trained priest or scribe might have understood the texts as expressing sophisticated theological and cosmological principles. A farmer or craftsperson hearing the story told by a traveling musician might have understood it primarily as a narrative about powerful beings and cosmic boundaries, without necessarily engaging with the deeper theological implications. And a king or political leader might have understood it as supporting the principle that order is maintained through the exercise of authority and the enforcement of boundaries. This recognition that texts might have been understood differently by different audiences is consistent with what modern scholars understand about how religious and literary texts are actually used in societies. Texts rarely have a single, fixed meaning that is understood identically by everyone. Instead, different people extract different meanings from texts, understanding them in light of their own concerns and their own level of learning. The texts about the Igigi and their separation from the earth would have been no exception. The same tablet that was studied by a scholar for its theological implications might have been the source of a story that a priest recounted to an assembled crowd at a religious festival, and the meaning that the crowd derived from the story might have been somewhat different from the meaning that the scholar extracted through careful analysis. The question of who actually created the tablets that record the separation of the Igigi from the earth, and what their purposes and concerns were, is also an area of ongoing scholarly investigation. The texts do not explicitly state who wrote them or when they were written, though colophons on some copies provide information about later copyists. Some scholars have suggested that the texts might have been created during a period when there were anxieties or concerns about the boundaries between different realms, or about the possibility of unwanted incursions of divine beings into human affairs. From this perspective, the creation and preservation of texts documenting the separation of the Igigi could be understood as a kind of response to a particular set of concerns, a way of asserting and maintaining boundaries that seem to be under threat. Other scholars have focused more on the question of how the concept of separation and boundary gradually became more emphasized and more explicit in the Mesopotamian tradition over time. Earlier texts, they suggest, may have mentioned the Igigi and their distant relation to the earth more in passing, without explicitly emphasizing the permanence and absoluteness of the separation. Later texts, as the tradition developed, seem to place increasing emphasis on the completeness of the separation, the permanence of the boundary, and the cosmic importance of maintaining this boundary. This development might reflect changes in how Mesopotamian thinkers conceptualize cosmic order, or it might reflect changing social and political concerns that made the metaphor of separation and boundary increasingly relevant. The question of how the concepts and narrative material concerning the Igigi and their separation from the earth influenced later religious and philosophical traditions has also attracted scholarly attention. As Mesopotamian ideas spread to other cultures and other peoples, as texts were translated and transmitted across linguistic and cultural boundaries, the message about the separation of powerful beings from the realm of human activity would have been available to influence how other peoples thought about cosmic boundaries and divine power. Some scholars have suggested that echoes of the Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic separation might be found in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theological traditions, in which the transcendence of God and the separation of the divine from the human are also understood as fundamental to cosmic order. However, scholars who work in this comparative area are generally cautious about claiming direct historical connections between Mesopotamian concepts and later theological traditions without strong evidence of actual transmission and influence. It is possible that similar concepts might develop independently in different cultures as thinkers grapple with similar problems and questions. The observation that different cultures have developed concepts of cosmic separation and divine transcendence does not necessarily prove that one influenced the other, though in some cases historical evidence does support the conclusion that there was indeed influence and transmission. Throughout all of this scholarly interpretation and analysis, what remains clear is that the tablet or tablets that record the separation of the Igigi from the earth address a question that has been of fundamental importance to human civilization. How is the cosmos organized? What principles govern it? And what is the relationship between different kinds of beings and different realms within that cosmos? The fact that Mesopotamian scribes and scholars devoted so much effort to preserving and transmitting the knowledge contained in these tablets testifies to their sense that these questions were important, that the answers contained in the tablets were valuable, and that this knowledge needed to be preserved for future generations. As modern scholars continue to study these ancient texts, to translate them more accurately, to understand them more deeply, and to situate them within the broader context of Mesopotamian civilization and thought, the message that the tablets convey continues to resonate. The Igigi, separated and confined to the realm of the sky, unable to reach the earth, serve as a kind of reminder that the cosmos is organized according to principles that transcend individual will or desire, that boundaries matter, that proper order depends on respecting and maintaining the separations that cosmic law has established. In a world that is often chaotic and confusing, the careful preservation and transmission of these ancient truths, recorded on tablets of clay that have survived thousands of years, speaks to something deep in the human need to understand and to preserve knowledge against the erosion of time. When we speak of the tablet that records the separation of the Igigi from the earth, we are speaking of a physical object, a piece of clay that was shaped by human hands, pressed with marks that encode language, left to dry in the sun, until it became hard enough to preserve its form, essentially unchanged for millennia. To understand the full significance of this tablet, it is important to think not merely about what the tablet says, but about the tablet itself as a material object, about how it was made, how it was used, how it was preserved, and how it made its journey through time until it reached the hands of modern archaeologists and scholars. Clay tablets of the kind used in ancient Mesopotamia were created through a process that was relatively simple, but required skill and knowledge. The scribe would begin with clay that had been prepared and made ready for writing. This clay needed to be of the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry, so that it could be shaped and marked without crumbling or cracking. The clay would have been sourced locally in Mesopotamia, dug from riverbeds and other locations where suitable clay could be found. Once prepared, the clay would be shaped into a tablet of the desired size and thickness. For a text of moderate length, a tablet might be roughly the size of a human hand, perhaps 4 or 5 inches in length and 3 or 4 inches in width, and perhaps half an inch thick. The scribe would then sit with the tablet before him and begin to press marks into the surface using a stylus, typically made of reed or bone. The stylus had a wedge-shaped end, and by pressing it into the clay at different angles and with varying pressure, the scribe could create the distinctive marks that make up cuneiform writing. A skilled scribe could work relatively quickly, and a tablet of moderate length might be completed in an hour or two of focused work. But creating a text like the one recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth, a text of considerable length with precise theological language and careful attention to proper phrasing, would have required patience and concentration. Once the text had been pressed into the tablet would be left to dry. In the dry climate of Mesopotamia, clay tablets would dry quickly, usually within a few days. As the clay dried, it would harden progressively, eventually becoming quite hard and brittle. A dried clay tablet, if not deliberately broken, could last essentially forever, unlike papyrus, which could rot if exposed to moisture, or parchment, which could be eaten by insects or damaged by mold. Clay was remarkably durable. This durability was well understood by ancient scribes, and it was one of the primary reasons that important texts were recorded on clay rather than on more perishable materials. However, the durability of clay came with a price. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay tablets could not be easily erased or corrected. If a scribe made an error while copying, he could sometimes smooth over the mistake and rewrite the text, but more often he simply continued, leaving the error in place. This meant that texts on clay, once written, became fixed and permanent. There was no way to create a perfect copy. Each copy was made fresh by a new scribe, and each new copy might contain its own errors or variations. The physical characteristics of a tablet could tell a scholar something about its age, its purpose, and the care that had been taken in its creation. A tablet that was carefully made, with regular dimensions and clean, well-formed cuneiform signs, would suggest that it had been created by a skilled scribe, that it was intended to be a formal, official document. A tablet that was irregular in shape, or that contained hastily written marks, might suggest a more casual, informal document. The size of the tablet could indicate something about the length and importance of the text. Short administrative records might be written on small tablets, while longer literary or scholarly texts would require larger tablets or a series of tablets. The tablets that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth, given their importance and theological significance, would likely have been carefully created, would have displayed good craftsmanship, and would have been handled with respect. Multiple copies would have been made over the centuries, and each copy would have been a careful reproduction of the original text. The tablets would have been stored in designated library areas within temples, preserved in conditions that protected them from the elements. They would have been consulted by scholars, studied by priests, and occasionally copied to create new versions when the original copy began to show signs of wear. The journey of these tablets through history is one of remarkable preservation against odds that might have seemed impossible. The library at Nineveh, where multiple copies of important texts were carefully preserved by order of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, was destroyed in 612 before the Common Era when the city fell to an alliance of enemies. One might imagine that such destruction would have meant the end of the tablets, that they would have been ground to powder under the weight of collapsing buildings and the flames of fire. Yet clay, when baked by fire, becomes even harder and more durable. The destruction of Nineveh, paradoxically, may have actually helped to preserve the tablets by baking them harder and by covering them with rubble and ash that protected them from erosion and from the elements. After the destruction of Nineveh, the tablets lay buried beneath the ruins of the city for more than 2,500 years. During all of that time, the knowledge they contained was effectively inaccessible. The language they were written in fell out of use. The script in which they were written became unreadable to the peoples who inhabited the region. The tablets themselves were sealed away, hidden from view, preserved accidentally by the very process of destruction that had seemed to spell their doom. The rediscovery of these tablets came about through a combination of European curiosity, archaeological exploration, and perhaps a degree of chance. When European scholars and adventurers began to explore the mounds of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, they did so partly out of a desire to verify or expand upon the historical information contained in the Bible, partly out of a general interest in uncovering the past, and partly out of a sense that the great civilizations of the ancient world deserved to be studied and understood. When Austin Henry Layard began his excavations at the site of Nineveh in the 1840s, he did not know exactly what he would find, but he had good reason to believe that the ruins of the Assyrian capital would contain valuable materials. The excavation of Nineveh was not a delicate, systematic process by modern standards. The excavators dug large trenches through the mounds, searching for structures and objects of value. Many tablets were found in situ, still in the libraries or archives where they had been placed thousands of years before. Other tablets were found scattered among rubble, their original context lost through the destruction and the subsequent exposure to the elements over millennia. Some tablets were broken into fragments, their pieces separated and sometimes lost. Much valuable contextual information was lost because the excavators did not have the knowledge or the methodology to carefully document exactly where each tablet had been found and what other objects had been associated with it. Yet despite these limitations, the excavations were successful in recovering thousands of tablets, including multiple copies of many important texts. The tablets were carefully packed and transported to Europe, where they were cataloged, preserved in museum collections, and made available for scholarly study. The tablets recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth were among those recovered, and they eventually found their way into the great museum collections, where they could be studied by scholars who were learning to read cuneiform. The process of scholarly study itself transformed the tablets in certain ways. Once the meaning of the texts had been recovered through translation, the tablets were no longer merely mysterious objects covered with incomprehensible marks. They had become windows into the thinking of ancient peoples, sources of information about how the ancients had understood their world. The tablets were photographed so that images could be preserved and studied and compared. They were carefully transliterated, with each cuneiform sign being converted into a modern alphabetic representation that made the text accessible to scholars who could read the alphabetic script, but not cuneiform. The texts were translated into English, German, French, and other modern languages, so that the knowledge they contained could be accessed by a broad audience. The physical tablets themselves, meanwhile, continue to be preserved in museums, where they remain today. They are protected in climate-controlled storage facilities, kept at stable temperatures and humidity levels to prevent damage. They are regularly examined and photographed, sometimes with new technologies that allow scholars to see details that might not be visible to the naked eye. The tablets are considered valuable cultural artifacts, part of the heritage of human civilization, deserving of careful preservation and respect. There is something profound about the existence of these physical tablets, about the fact that we can actually hold in our hands pieces of clay that were marked by scribes thousands of years ago. The tablets are not abstractions, not merely texts that exist in the form of translated words in modern books. They are material objects, artifacts created by human hands, bearing the marks of human intention and human effort. When one looks at a clay tablet, at the individual cuneiform marks pressed into its surface, one is looking at the direct result of a human decision to preserve and transmit knowledge, a decision that was made thousands of years ago, but that continues to have consequences in the present day. The journey of a single tablet through time is a journey through empires and civilizations, through conquest and destruction, through periods of use and periods of burial, through forgetting and rediscovery. A tablet created by a scribe in a Sumerian temple, perhaps copied and recopied by successive generations of scribes as it was transmitted through Akkadian, Kassite, and Babylonian hands, eventually arriving at Nineveh where it was preserved in the great library of Ashurbanipal. Such a tablet carries within itself the history of an entire civilization, evidence of the values and the concerns that motivated that civilization. The fact that multiple copies of the text recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth were made and preserved, that these copies were stored in different locations and in different time periods, meant that even if some copies were lost or destroyed, others would survive. This redundancy was not accidental, but was a deliberate strategy, a way of ensuring that important knowledge would not be completely lost, even if some physical objects were damaged. The priests and scholars who commissioned the copying of these texts understood that they were engaged in a kind of race against time, attempting to preserve knowledge that they recognized as important against the possibility that war, disaster, or simple neglect might cause the knowledge to be lost. The tablets recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth thus represent a kind of success story in the history of human knowledge preservation. The knowledge that ancient scribes worked to preserve through careful copying and preservation survived the destruction of the civilizations that created them, survived thousands of years of burial in the earth, survived the transformation of languages and the replacement of writing systems, and eventually reached modern times, where it could be recovered, translated, and made accessible to contemporary readers. The process was not inevitable. It depended on accidents of preservation, on the particular decisions of particular people, on the durability of clay and the care of scribes. In our own time, when knowledge is preserved in digital forms and can be replicated infinitely without loss of quality, it is easy to take for granted the fact that important information can be preserved and transmitted across time. But for the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia, the task of preservation was much more difficult and uncertain. The fact that they succeeded, that they managed to preserve important knowledge through an entire process of civilization, transformation, conquest, and destruction, speaks to a kind of determination and a kind of faith in the value of knowledge that deserves our respect and our admiration. The tablet that records the separation of the Igigi from the earth, then, is not merely a text or a narrative. It is a physical object that embodies human effort, human intention, and human hope, that the knowledge it contains will endure and will continue to matter to future generations. It is a kind of message cast into the future, a deliberate attempt by ancient peoples to communicate with those who would come after them, to share with them the truths that they had come to understand about the nature of the cosmos and the principles by which it operated. As we come to the end of our journey through the history of the Igigi and the tablet that records their separation from the earth, it is worth pausing to consider what this ancient story means, why it has persisted through so many centuries and transformations, and what it might continue to mean to us in the present day. The separation of the Igigi from the earth is fundamentally a story about boundaries, about the necessity of maintaining clear distinctions between different realms and different kinds of beings. The ancient Mesopotamian peoples who created and transmitted this story were expressing a conviction that the cosmos is ordered, that this order depends on the maintenance of boundaries, and that the crossing or violation of these boundaries would result in chaos and disorder. This conviction was not merely a matter of theological abstraction. It was grounded in the actual experience of living in a land where the boundaries between the habitable and the uninhabitable, between order and chaos, were very real and very consequential. The Sumerians and Akkadians and later Mesopotamian peoples lived in a landscape where the difference between a properly maintained irrigation system and a neglected one was the difference between abundance and famine. They lived in a region where the seasonal floods of the rivers, if properly directed and managed, were sources of life and fertility, but if left uncontrolled, would bring destruction. They lived in a climate where the line between the areas capable of supporting human settlement and the vast deserts and marshes that surrounded these areas was clear and sharp. In such a landscape, the principle that boundaries need to be maintained and carefully managed was not a mere metaphor or abstraction. It was a basic fact about survival. This grounding of cosmological principle in actual experience might help to explain why the story of the Igigi's separation from the earth would have carried such weight and significance for Mesopotamian peoples. The story was not merely expressing an abstract theological idea. It was expressing a principle that was validated by daily experience, that people could see and understand in the actual world around them. The separation of the Igigi from the earth was thus a kind of cosmic parallel to the separations and boundaries that had to be maintained on earth. The boundary between cultivated land and desert, between the irrigated fields and the waters that would destroy them if left uncontrolled, between the organized city and the chaotic regions that lay beyond its walls. The question of what the tablet meant, the specific document or documents that recorded the separation of the Igigi from the earth, is also a question about what writing itself meant in Mesopotamian civilization. In a world where written documents were relatively rare and precious, where the ability to read and write was a valued skill possessed by only a small percentage of the population, the act of writing something down was itself significant. To have written the separation of the Igigi onto a clay tablet was to have asserted that this knowledge was important enough to be preserved, that it deserved to be fixed in permanent form, that it needed to be available for consultation by future generations. Moreover, the act of writing the separation down was understood not merely as recording an event that had occurred, but as affirming and maintaining the separation itself. The tablet was not merely a description of cosmic order. It was understood as playing an active role in maintaining that cosmic order through the power that was believed to inhere in written words. By preserving the tablet, by copying it, by consulting it and reading the words contained in it, the priests and scholars were understood to be actively maintaining the cosmic boundary, ensuring that the Igigi remained separated from the earth, that the order of the cosmos continued to function as it should. This understanding of the power of writing to create and maintain reality is foreign to modern sensibilities. In our contemporary world, writing is understood primarily as a neutral medium for representing information that exists independently of the writing. We think of a text as a description of reality, not as something that helps to create or maintain reality. But for the ancient Mesopotamians, the relationship between word and reality was more intimate and more mysterious. Words were understood as having power, as being capable of bringing things into being, or of maintaining the existence of things. The written word was understood as having even more power than the spoken word, because it was fixed and permanent, because it could not be forgotten or altered through the passage of time. This understanding of the power of writing helps to explain the enormous effort that was devoted to copying and preserving text, like the one recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth. It was not merely a matter of preserving information for historical or scholarly purposes. It was a matter of maintaining the cosmos itself, of ensuring that the cosmic order continued to function, of affirming through the act of writing and copying that the boundaries established by the gods would remain in place. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth also speaks to deeper human concerns about power, authority, and the limits of freedom. The Igigi were powerful beings, but their power was limited. They were not free to do whatever they wished, but rather were constrained by cosmic law, confined to the realm assigned to them, prohibited from crossing certain boundaries. In a civilization that was intensely concerned with order and with the maintenance of hierarchies of power and authority, this story of powerful beings being constrained and limited would have carried a particular resonance. For the rulers of Mesopotamian cities and empires, the story of the Igigi could be understood as providing cosmic sanction for the principle that power must be exercised within limits, that even the greatest authorities are subject to law, that order is maintained not through the arbitrary exercise of power, but through the imposition and maintenance of boundaries and rules. For the common people, the story could be understood as suggesting that all beings, no matter how powerful, are subject to cosmic law, that there are principles that transcend individual will or desire, that no one, not even the gods themselves, can violate these principles without bringing chaos and disorder. The separation of the Igigi from the earth might also be understood as expressing a kind of cosmic inevitability or tragedy. The Igigi were powerful beings, and their separation from the earth represents a kind of loss, a restriction of their freedom and their possibility for action. Yet this restriction is presented as necessary, as unavoidable, as something that could not be otherwise, without bringing about the destruction of cosmic order. There is a kind of sorrow in this understanding, that even the greatest powers must sometimes accept limitations, that freedom must sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of order, that the cosmos requires sacrifices from all of its inhabitants. This theme of inevitable limitation and necessary sacrifice would have resonated with many aspects of Mesopotamian experience. People lived with the constant awareness that their own freedoms and desires were limited by forces beyond their control, by the weather, by the unpredictability of the rivers, by the authority of their rulers, by the will of the gods. The story of the Igigi provided a kind of cosmic frame for understanding these limitations, a way of seeing them not as merely unfortunate accidents or unjust impositions, but as expressions of a cosmic principle that governed all beings without exception. As we consider the legacy of the story of the Igigi's separation from the earth, it is important to recognize that the meaning of this story has not remained static. Different peoples at different times have understood the story in different ways, have extracted different meanings from it, have applied it to their own concerns and their own understanding of the world. The Sumerians who first created the story understood it in one way. The Akkadians who adopted and adapted it understood it in a somewhat different way. The Babylonians, the Kassites, the Assyrians, and later peoples all engaged with the story, each bringing their own perspectives and concerns to the interpretation of its meaning. Even in modern times, the story continues to be interpreted in different ways by different people. Scholars studying the ancient texts attempt to recover what the story meant to those who originally created and transmitted it. But the story is also available to contemporary readers who can engage with it in their own ways, extracting meanings that are relevant to their own concerns in their own time. The separation of the Igigi from the earth can be read as a story about cosmic order, as a story about the limits of power, as a story about the necessity of maintaining boundaries, as a story about the power of writing and knowledge to shape reality. Different readers will find different meanings in the story, and all of these meanings may be valid expressions of what the story has to offer. The tablet itself, the physical object that records the separation of the Igigi from the earth, is also a kind of symbol or emblem of the act of preservation itself. For more than 2,000 years, this tablet lay buried and inaccessible, its message sealed away from human understanding. Yet it survived intact, waiting to be discovered. When it was finally discovered and its message was recovered through the work of dedicated scholars, it became clear that the effort to preserve the knowledge had been successful. The knowledge that ancient scribes had worked so carefully to preserve had endured, had survived the destruction of the civilization that created it, and had been transmitted to us in the present day. There is something hopeful in this story of preservation and recovery. It suggests that human efforts to preserve and transmit knowledge are not futile, that what we write down and preserve carefully might survive longer than we can imagine, might reach audiences we never anticipated, might continue to have meaning and significance long after we ourselves are gone. The tablet recording the separation of the Igigi from the earth is a testament to the power of writing to transcend time, to the ability of human beings to reach across centuries and millennia to communicate with those who will come after them. In our own time, when we are developing new technologies for preserving and transmitting information, when we are creating digital archives and databases designed to last for centuries or millennia, the example of the Mesopotamian clay tablets is instructive. The Mesopotamians could not have imagined the technologies we have developed, but they understood something fundamental about the importance of preservation, about the need to create physical objects that could survive the passage of time and the transformations of civilization. The fact that clay tablets, created more than 3,000 years ago, still exist in a readable form and can still convey their message to readers in the present day, suggests that the ancient peoples understood something important about how knowledge can be preserved and transmitted across vast spans of time. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth also invites us to reflect on our own understanding of boundaries and order. In our contemporary world, we live with various kinds of boundaries between nations, between different ethnic and cultural groups, between different social classes, between the natural world and the human world. The ancient Mesopotamian insistence on the importance of maintaining boundaries might seem at first to be a message that could be used to justify all kinds of injustice and oppression. But understood more deeply, the message is not that boundaries are good in themselves, but rather that the cosmos functions according to principles and laws, that these principles and laws need to be understood and respected, and that chaos and disorder result when they are ignored or violated. This deeper understanding of the meaning of cosmic boundaries might suggest that the real question is not whether boundaries should exist, but what kinds of boundaries are justified, how they should be maintained, and what happens when they become rigid or oppressive. The tablet that records the separation of the Igigi from the earth does not tell us how to answer these questions for our own time, but it invites us to think about them seriously, to recognize that the principles by which we organize our world matter deeply, and that the effort to understand and maintain proper order is a fundamental human concern that goes back to the very roots of human civilization. As we draw toward the close of this exploration, let us return to the simple fact of the tablet itself. It is a piece of clay, marked with wedge-shaped signs that encode language, preserved through thousands of years of history, eventually to reach modern eyes. It is an object created by human hands with intention and care for the purpose of preserving knowledge. It has survived wars and invasions, the destruction of cities, the collapse of civilizations, the replacement of languages and writing systems, and the accumulation of countless generations. It sits today in a museum, protected and preserved, available for anyone who wishes to study it, carrying within itself a message about cosmic order, about boundaries, about the necessary separation of powerful beings from the realm of human activity. The knowledge that the tablet contains, that the Igigi were separated from the earth, that this separation is permanent and cosmic in nature, that it is recorded and preserved in a written document, may seem distant and strange to modern readers. The theological framework in which this knowledge was originally understood may seem alien to us, but the underlying concerns that the knowledge expresses, the concern with order and boundary, with the maintenance of separations that allow the cosmos to function properly, with the power of knowledge and writing to preserve truth across time, these concerns are not alien. They are fundamental human concerns that persist across time and across the boundaries between different cultures and different ways of understanding the world. The tablet reminds us that human beings have always been concerned with understanding the cosmos, with preserving knowledge, with passing truth on to future generations. The ancient scribes who pressed cuneiform marks into clay and left the tablets to dry in the Mesopotamian sun were engaged in the same essential task that we are engaged in today when we write down our knowledge, when we create databases and archives, when we work to ensure that important information is preserved for those who will come after us. The specific methods have changed, the technologies have evolved, but the fundamental impulse, to understand the world and to preserve that understanding so that it will not be lost, remains constant. And so we come to the end of our journey through the history of the separation of the Igigi from the earth. We have traced the creation of this story in ancient Mesopotamia, its preservation through centuries of copying and transmission, its near loss when civilizations fell and writing systems changed, its eventual recovery by modern scholars, and its translation into the languages and conceptual frameworks of the contemporary world. Throughout this long journey, the tablet has endured, carrying its message forward, waiting patiently in the earth until the day when human beings would once again be able to understand and appreciate what it had to say. The story of the Igigi and their separation from the earth is ultimately a story about the power of knowledge to endure, about the importance of boundaries and order, about the way that cosmic principles transcend individual power and individual will. It is a story that ancient peoples understood as expressing profound truths about the nature of reality, and it is a story that continues to speak across the centuries, inviting us to think carefully about the principles by which we organize our own world, about the boundaries that we maintain and why those boundaries matter, about the ways that we preserve and transmit knowledge to those who will come after us. The tablet rests now in quiet preservation, its work of maintaining cosmic order, continuing in the realm of thought and understanding, its message available to all who wish to engage with it. The Igigi remain in the sky, separated and contained, the boundary that was established so long ago remaining in place, maintained by the written record and by the human effort to remember and transmit the knowledge that the tablet contains. And we who read the tablet today, who understand what it says, who appreciate the care and intention that went into its creation and preservation, participate in that ongoing effort to maintain the boundary, to preserve the cosmic order, to ensure that the knowledge that ancient peoples held dear continues to speak across the distances of time. Let the fan turn softly through the evening air. Let your breathing settle into a steady rhythm, easy and unhurried. The room around you grows quiet. The world outside fades into dimness. The tablet has delivered its message. The journey is complete. The story has been told. The ancient Sumerians and Akkadians, and all the peoples of Mesopotamia who worked to preserve this knowledge, rest now in the darkness of history, their work done, their intention fulfilled. The separation of the Igigi from the earth remains in place. Cosmic law continues to govern the boundaries between the realms, and the written record continues to endure, a bridge between the ancient past and the present moment. Rest easy knowing that the past rests peacefully, while tomorrow waits with its own steady rhythm. The knowledge that was preserved so carefully thousands of years ago has reached you now, has become part of your understanding of how the ancient world thought about order and boundary and cosmic law. That knowledge will continue forward, transmitted from mind to mind, carried in words and in memory, much as the clay tablets were carried forward by scribes and scholars across the centuries. The cosmos continues its ordered motion, the Igigi remain in their appointed place, and the tablet stands as a quiet witness to the human effort to understand and preserve truth. Sleep well, and know that the ancient world rests with you through the night, its secrets shared, its mysteries gently revealed.